Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Story 1. Grain, taxes, and broken roads infrastructure collapse in late Roman Gaul. In the early 4th century, Gaul was still one of the beating hearts of the Roman Empire. Stretching from the Rhine to the Atlantic, it was a land of rolling hills, fertile fields, and crisscrossed stone roads. These roads, originally built centuries earlier by Roman engineers, were not just military highways, they were the supply lines of empire, conduits for tax, grain, merchants, and officials. But by the late 4th century, they were beginning to crack. Not all at once, and not in some dramatic blaze of destruction. No, the roads simply weren't repaired. A bridge washed out during a seasonal flood and was left unmended. A section of road near modern-day Reims buckled under heavy rain and remained treacherous for months. Local towns, once proud of their public works, quietly let milestones and rest stops fall into disrepair. It wasn't neglect by the people, it was neglect by the system. The problem of distance and overextension. By this point, Rome's central bureaucracy was bloated but increasingly ineffective. Decisions about road repairs or grain shipments could take months to wind their way from a provincial governor in Gaul to the imperial court in Milan or Ravenna, and longer still to be approved if they were approved at all. And so, rural communities began turning inward. What had once been bustling villas tied to regional markets became isolated farming estates. Barter replaced coinage in some areas. Travel became dangerous not because of constant raids or wars, but simply because there was no longer a reliable way to get from place to place. The wheels of the empire still turned, but slowly, too slowly. Taxation without infrastructure. One might think the Romans would adjust, but tax collection remained relentless, even as the systems that enabled payment crumbled. Roman tax collectors, the exactors, still arrived in villages demanding quotas of grain, livestock, or labor. The trouble was, many local producers couldn't deliver. Consider the case of a small landholder in northern Gaul around 390 CE. He still owed tax in grain, even though the road to the nearest granary had been impassable for months. There was no military escort, no supply caravan, no engineer corps to clear the path. If he could not get the grain there, it spoiled or was taken by local bandits, often former soldiers turned brigands. But the tax debt remained. Debtors could be jailed or worse, their land confiscated. This led many to abandon their plots entirely, becoming colony tenant farmers tied to large estates, halfway between free men and slaves. Gaul's vanishing middle class. These changes weren't always visible from the top. To imperial bureaucrats, the record still looked fine on parchment. The taxes were assessed, the roads existed, the towns paid their dues, but reality drifted from the record. Small towns like Andamantunum, modern Langurs, lost their civic identity. City councils, curiae, dwindled, as the local elites who once served in unpaid civic roles abandoned the posts to avoid financial ruin. The position of decurion, once a badge of pride, became a burden avoided at all costs. By 400 CE, the once thriving urban networks of Gaul had largely unraveled into isolated clusters of agricultural self-reliance. The dream of a connected, mobile empire was quietly fading into a patchwork of semi-autonomous rural enclaves. Trade in a time of tedium. Merchants still operated, of course. Some even thrived, especially those who could navigate the shifting boundaries between Roman and barbarian territories. But for many, long-distance trade became a losing game. Tariffs were unpredictable, roads were unsafe. There were fewer places to stop, rest, or resupply. Letters and news arrived infrequently. The idea of a unified Roman economy gave way to local markets, local prices, and local solutions. Even the famed Roman postal system, the cursus publicus, began to falter under its own weight. The quiet rewilding of the Roman landscape. And then there's what nature does when humans stop maintaining the environment. Abandoned roads became overgrown with weeds. Moss crept into cracked paving stones. Old mile markers sank into the soil. Wolves returned to areas they had not been seen in for centuries, and forests crept back into once cleared fields. Travelers would sometimes pass through ghost towns, where temples still stood but no worshippers came. The Roman world was not ending in fire, but in silence. A changing climate. Some scholars argue that shifting climate patterns contributed to this collapse. Shorter growing seasons, more erratic rainfall, and localized droughts may have strained agricultural output. Without robust trade networks or infrastructure to shift surpluses from one region to another, a failed harvest could devastate a community. Add to that the pressure of migrating peoples: Visigoths, Franks, Vandals seeking new lands, and the situation grew more unstable by the year. Yet the real decline wasn't just in fields or farms, but in the systems of coordination that once responded to these pressures. One man, one road, one letter never delivered. Imagine a Roman courier around 395 CE. He sets out from Trier with a letter bound for the capital, perhaps a governor's plea for aid. The letter outlines a desperate need for grain shipments, repairs to a key bridge, and reinforcements for a garrison post along the Moselle. But the bridge is out, the post is unmanned. The letter never arrives, or if it does, it is delayed beyond relevance. Multiply that failure by hundreds, then thousands, and you begin to understand how an empire can fall without a single decisive battle. An empire still standing, but not moving. By the dawn of the 5th century, Gaul was still nominally Roman. Coins bore the image of the emperor. Latin was still spoken in courts. Legionaries still patrolled certain borders. But the connective tissue was gone. The empire still existed on paper, but its arteries, its roads, towns, and bureaucracies were clogged or collapsed. It raises a quiet but haunting question. If an empire can no longer move, is it still an empire at all? By the time the Western Roman Empire entered the early 5th century, the breakdown of infrastructure in Gaul was no longer a creeping problem, it was a widespread reality. Yet the machinery of the Roman state, particularly its bureaucracy, did not slow down in proportion. In fact, in many ways it became more aggressive, heavier, less connected to reality. It is a curious thing, and not entirely unique to Rome, that as states decline in effectiveness, they often increase in demands. The bureaucratic illusion of control. The imperial administration continued to levy taxes, mandate services, and issue edicts as though the roads were still maintained, the army still efficient, and the people still mobile. Paperwork multiplied. Governors wrote desperate letters, some preserved in later compilations, pleading for tax relief, reinforcements, or exemption from mandatory grain shipments. But the bureaucratic center, no longer able to distinguish signal from noise, responded with routine. More assessors were dispatched. More decrees were issued. New tax laws were written with mathematical precision, but applied to communities that no longer resembled the economic model envisioned by the capital. One striking example comes from the administration of the annona militaris, a grain tax used to feed the army. Originally designed to be efficient and fair, it became wildly unjust in practice. Smallholders, already impoverished by raiding, drought, or road collapse, were still taxed based on land value assessments from decades earlier. There was no systemic revaluation, only increased pressure to meet quotas. Corruption at the edges. Into this gap between state expectation and local reality stepped corruption. With imperial inspectors arriving irregularly, local tax collectors, exactors, and susceptors began adjusting numbers to protect themselves. Some underreported, others overcollected, keeping the difference. Wealthy landowners increasingly paid bribes or arranged exemptions. Meanwhile, the poor were squeezed. Some communities fled entirely rather than face tax collection. Entire villages disappeared into the woods, becoming Bacchae peasant bands that lived on the margins, resisting both Roman officials and outside invaders. They were not always political rebels in the traditional sense. More often, they were simply exhausted, broken by a state that no longer provided anything but demands. The rise of private power. With the weakening of central control, large landowners began to assume state functions. These were the senators, the local aristocracy of old Roman families or newly rich military men. Their estates became self-sufficient units. They built private mills, kept armed retainers, and resolved disputes in local courts they controlled. Some even minted unofficial coinage or issued tokens for use by laborers on their land. Their status was legal, but increasingly independent. The imperial government tried to maintain appearances. Titles like comes, count, or dux, duke, were granted to such men, offering legitimacy in exchange for allegiance. But often, the loyalty was thin. The empire needed these aristocrats more than they needed the empire. Urban shrinkage and the silent cities. Cities, once the crown jewels of Roman administration and culture, began to fade. Arles, Lyon, and Trier had once boasted temples, amphitheaters, and public baths. By the 5th century, many of these were in disrepair. Some temples had been dismantled for building materials. Others were abandoned as Christianity reshaped urban life. Public works like aqueducts and sewer systems were no longer repaired. Water quality declined. Disease followed. Populations shrank, and many city inhabitants returned to the countryside, where subsistence farming offered more security than urban dependence. A letter from Sidonius Apollinaris, a Roman aristocrat in Gaul, reveals this shift. He laments how cities had become hollowed shells of their former selves, still ringed by walls, but devoid of civic pride. The decurions who once governed cities had largely vanished. Curial councils barely met. Responsibilities were passed from official to official like burdens no one wished to carry. The church steps in. As civil administration weakened, the Christian church stepped into the void. Bishops began organizing food distribution, maintaining orphanages, and even arbitrating disputes. Churches became granaries, sanctuaries, and courts of last resort. In towns where the imperial government no longer operated, bishops functioned as de facto governors. Their records were better maintained than those of secular officials. Their decisions often held more sway than imperial edicts. This was not always welcomed by imperial authorities, but in practice, the church was often more capable of providing what the people needed. Its infrastructure, built around monasteries, bishoprics, and dioceses, was simpler, more localized, and more trusted. The Roman army as a burden. Meanwhile, the Western Roman army was no longer the sleek professional force it had once been. It had become both smaller and more demanding. Because of the collapse of central recruitment, many local garrisons were under strength. The army increasingly relied on foederati non-Roman troops given land or pay in exchange for military service. These included Franks, Alemanni, and other Germanic peoples, some of whom had once fought against Rome. But perhaps more troubling was how the army interacted with local populations. In Gaul, it was not uncommon for troops to requisition supplies without payment. The hospitalitas system, which required civilians to house soldiers, had become a source of exploitation. Towns dreaded the arrival of military units not for protection, but for plunder. Desertion was rampant. Morale was low. Officers often had more loyalty to local lords than to Rome. The fragmentation of authority. By 410 CE, the Western Roman Empire's ability to command Gaul had fragmented beyond easy repair. There was no single moment of collapse, no climactic battle, no formal secession. Instead, there was drift. Some regions still followed imperial governors. Others responded to local bishops or aristocrats. Still others lived under semi-independent warlords. Communication between them was spotty at best. Political unity was replaced by a patchwork of authority. In this climate, the identity of being Roman shifted. It was no longer about allegiance to a central emperor or even a language. It became about lifestyle, education, religion, values that could persist even in the absence of state control. What the sources tell us and what they do. One challenge in studying this period is the nature of the historical record. Much of what we know comes from a few surviving letters, legal codes, and later chronicles. We hear the voices of bishops, aristocrats, and some military officials. But the peasants who fled taxation, the villagers who let roads collapse, the blacksmiths and millers who kept daily life going, these are largely silent. What we can piece together is indirect. Archaeology tells us which towns shrank, where roads fell out of use, and how material culture changed. Fewer imported goods, more handmade pottery. Coins disappear from the archaeological record in many rural areas, suggesting not poverty, but a shift to non-monetary exchange. We also see a change in burial practices, reflecting a population increasingly detached from Roman norms and increasingly shaped by regional or tribal customs. A time of waiting. In many ways, the early 5th century in Gaul was a time of waiting. Not passive waiting, but uncertain expectation. People knew something had changed. The old ways didn't work, but no new order had yet replaced them. There were rumors of invasions, stories of civil wars in Italy, distant emperors rising and falling. But for many, daily life revolved around survival, planting crops, avoiding tax collectors, praying for rain. The Roman Empire was still alive, technically. But in Gaul, it was like an old building wall still standing, but no longer inhabited. And as more communities adapted to this new reality, fewer sought help from Rome. They built their own defenses, negotiated with nearby powers, ignored distant officials. They didn't declare independence, they just stopped expecting anything different. Not a collapse, a withdrawal. It's tempting to describe this period as a collapse, but that word implies a suddenness that doesn't fit. The Western Roman Empire in Gaul didn't so much fall as fade away. It withdrew, piece by piece, function by function. Like a tide going out, it left behind structures, memories, and identities, but no coherence. Yet even as this happened, people kept going. They worked the fields, they raised children, they adapted. In some cases, they even flourished. And that's one of the more haunting truths of the Roman decline in Gaul. What if the people stopped relying on Rome and didn't miss it? By the middle of the 5th century, it was no longer accurate to call Gaul a Roman province in any meaningful sense. Though the imperial government maintained the fiction of control and still appointed governors, collected some taxes, and issued orders, the daily lives of people across the region had little to do with the state in Ravenna. Rome, in its traditional form, was no longer a presence, it was a memory. But like all memories, it left traces. The shape of a post-Roman world. Even as imperial institutions declined, their imprint lingered. Roman roads might have fallen into disrepair, but their foundations often remained. Later medieval paths, trade routes, and even modern highways follow their course. Roman towns shrank but did not disappear. Cities like Paris, Lutetia, Lyon, Lugdunum, and Toulouse, Tolosa continued as urban centers, though their function had shifted drastically. The villa system, A network of rural estates that had once connected elite landowners to imperial markets survived in a reduced form. These estates became fortified centers of power, often evolving into early feudal lordships. They produced for local consumption rather than imperial redistribution, and their owners, once Roman senators or retired military officials, became local warlords, bishops, or tribal leaders. The barbarian factor. One of the most significant shifts came not through violent invasion, but through gradual migration and settlement. Germanic groups such as the Franks, Visigoths, and Burgundians settled throughout Gaul, sometimes with the empire's approval, sometimes without. The Visigoths, originally refugees fleeing the Huns, had been settled by the empire in Aquitaine as foederati, federated allies, around 418 CE. Their king, Theodoric I, technically ruled as a servant of the Roman emperor, but in practice, he governed an independent kingdom from Toulouse. These groups did not destroy Roman life overnight. Many adopted Latin, Roman customs, and even Roman law. Visigothic rulers often employed Roman administrators and minted coins in the emperor's name. In some areas, Roman and Gothic populations lived side by side for generations. The barbarians did not conquer so much as fill a vacuum. Where Rome had receded, they built. Where roads were no longer maintained by the state, they repaired what they needed for their own purposes. Where Roman justice had failed, they established their own. Civic institutions transformed. Though the Roman Curia, the city council, had largely disappeared, civic life continued under new management. In many towns, the bishop's palace replaced the governor's residence as the seat of authority. Religious festivals replaced imperial ones. The church calendar structured the year more than imperial proclamations did. The church became the keeper of Latin literacy, classical learning, and Roman law. Monasteries collected scrolls, copied texts, and preserved what they could. Christian bishops styled themselves as heirs to Roman civic virtue, even as they criticized the old pagan past. In many ways, they were the new Romans. Everyday life after Rome. So what did daily life look like in a village or town in post-imperial Gaul? It depended on where you lived. In the countryside, large estates had become almost entirely self-sufficient. Coinage was rarely used. Barter or in-kind rent was common. Farmers grew spelt, barley, and wheat for local consumption. Villas were fortified, or at least defensible wooden palisades, replaced old stone walls. Pottery was handmade, not imported. Latin was still spoken, but it was slowly transforming into the early forms of French. In towns, public baths and forums were closed or converted to other uses. Some amphitheaters were repurposed as shelters or fortresses. The bishop was the central figure, religiously and politically. Markets still operated, but served a more local clientele. The memory of Rome persisted in architecture, arches, columns, inscriptions. People still thought of themselves as Roman, or at least as belonging to Roman traditions, even if there were no soldiers marching in the streets or emperors to obey. Legal and cultural continuity. One of the most fascinating aspects of this transition is how much continuity survived despite institutional collapse. The Lex Romana Visigothorum, issued by King Alaric II in 506 CE, was a codification of Roman law for his Roman subjects. It preserved legal traditions even as political structures changed. It suggests a population still invested in legal norms, contracts, inheritance, and land rights norms inherited from centuries of Roman jurisprudence. The Latin language, though slowly evolving, remained dominant in administration, the church, and elite households. Roman names were still given to children. Calendars still referenced Roman months and years. In essence, the Roman Empire lived on in habits, speech, law, and faith, even as its political framework dissolved. When Rome no longer meant Rome. And yet over time, the term Roman became less tied to an empire and more to a way of life. For some, Roman meant Christian. For others, it meant speaking Latin, owning land, or adhering to Roman law. For bishops and clerics, it meant preserving written culture. For barbarian elites, it meant wearing Roman-style clothing, living in Roman villas, and commissioning Latin inscriptions to legitimize their rule. The old Roman identity splintered into cultural fragments, each picked up by different groups, for different reasons. The vanishing emperor. By the time Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor, was deposed in 476 CE by the barbarian general Odoacer, many in Gaul hardly noticed. The imperial court had already lost influence decades earlier. Ravenna, the seat of the Western emperor, had been increasingly irrelevant to life north of the Alps. In fact, several cities in Gaul had stopped using imperial dating systems entirely. Local records began referencing the reigns of bishops or barbarian kings instead. The empire had faded not with a bang, but through a long erosion of relevance. A slow collapse or a gentle transformation. Modern historians debate how to frame this period. Traditional narratives speak of the fall of Rome as a tragic, cataclysmic collapse, a civilization lost. But others argue for a different lens: transformation, adaptation, and evolution. From this angle, what happened in Gaul was not destruction, but reconfiguration. The bones of the Roman world remained: its laws, roads, customs, language, but they were inhabited by new bodies. Roman Gaul didn't vanish. It became medieval France. The quiet survivors. Amid all these shifts, it's worth remembering the ordinary people who lived through it all: the farmers, smiths, weavers, monks, children. They woke each morning to feed animals, knead bread, dig soil, and pray for rain. Some served warlords, others listened to bishops, many simply tried to endure. They likely didn't speak of the fall of Rome. They spoke of droughts, taxes, wolves, and the weather. And yet their choices shaped the world that came next. In surviving, they rebuilt not the empire but something else. Something slower, smaller, but just as real. Echoes in the present. Even now in modern France, the legacy of Roman Gaul endures. Roads still follow ancient Roman paths. Place names preserve Latin roots. Legal traditions trace back to Roman codes. Christianity, introduced under imperial rule, still shapes spiritual life. The fall of Rome didn't erase the past, it sedimented it. And so in the crumbling roads and cracked mosaics of late Roman Gaul, we don't just see loss. We see layering, adaptation, persistence. But that leaves one last, quietly profound question. If a civilization can fade without fire or revolution, can it return the same way? Story 2. The Rise of the Foederati, when Rome outsourced its defense. As the Roman Empire strained under the weight of internal decay and external threats, it found itself facing a paradox. It needed more soldiers than ever, but could no longer afford to maintain a fully Roman army. The solution: outsourcing, but not to contractors as we think of them today, rather to entire peoples. These were the Foederati, foreign tribes settled within the empire's borders under formal agreements, foedus, to provide military assistance in exchange for land, food, and autonomy. It was a system born of necessity, but like many desperate solutions, it reshaped the empire in ways no decree could have predicted. Rome's growing military deficit. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Roman military was no longer the professional, highly trained machine that had once conquered the known world. Years of civil wars, frontier conflicts, and rising costs had gutted the army's cohesion. The comitatenses, field armies, and limitanae border garrisons were stretched thin. Recruitment from Roman citizenry declined. Pay was often delayed. Morale sank. To compensate, the empire leaned heavily on non-Roman recruits. This was not new. Rome had always used auxilia, non-citizen auxiliary troops, as a complement to its legions. What changed in the late empire was scale, autonomy, and control. Increasingly, entire groups Visigoths, Franks, Alemanni, Vandals were contracted not as individuals, but as tribal units, led by their own chiefs, fighting under their own banners. These were the foederati. The foedus, a contract of unequal understanding. The word foedus meant treaty or pact. In theory, it was a formal agreement between Rome and an allied tribe. In practice, the terms were rarely equal, clearly defined, or consistently upheld. Take the example of the Goths, first settled as foederati after the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, where Emperor Valens was killed. In the aftermath, the empire granted the Tervings, a Gothic group, land in the Balkans. The arrangement was simple. In exchange for settling and farming the land, they would provide military service when called. But this was not a Roman province being administered. It was a group of people living semi-independently within Roman territory, with their own laws, leaders, and goals. And as it turned out, those goals did not always align with Rome. A military patchwork. By the early 5th century, Rome's army resembled a patchwork quilt more than a unified force. One legion might be made up of Roman citizens stationed far from their homeland. Another, nearby, might consist of Gothic foederati under a tribal leader who had sworn an oath to the emperor but whose real loyalties remained murky. These foreign troops were sometimes effective. The Huns, famed for their cavalry, were employed by Roman generals as mercenaries. The Franks guarded the Rhine frontier. The Burgundians held sections of the Rhone Valley. Their knowledge of terrain, tactics, and local conditions could be valuable. But they also had autonomy. They answered to their own warlords, not to Roman officers. In battle, they might cooperate or they might not. The empire's quiet compromise. Why did Rome allow this? The answer, in part, is pragmatic. The empire no longer had the manpower to enforce military control across its vast territory. Paying off tribes, granting them land, and integrating them as foederati was cheaper and faster than raising new legions. Moreover, Roman officials often believed they could control these groups through diplomacy, bribes, and the promise of imperial favor. It was a gamble. Sometimes it worked temporarily. But over time, the foederati began to act less like auxiliaries and more like rulers. The Visigoths in Aquitaine, foederati as kings. One of the most telling cases is the settlement of the Visigoths in southern Gaul. In 418 CE, following years of warfare and uneasy coexistence, the Emperor Honorius granted the Visigoths land in Aquitaine, a fertile region in southwestern Gaul. They would live there as foederati, protecting the frontier and aiding in defense. But this was not a Roman province anymore in the traditional sense. The Visigoths lived under their own king, first Wallia, then Theodoric I. They collected their own taxes, judged their own laws, and operated independently. In essence, the Roman Empire had subcontracted the region's defense to a foreign kingdom inside its own borders. For a while, the arrangement held. The Visigoths helped repel invasions and kept relative peace, but their ambitions grew. Theodoric sought to expand into Spain. His successors pressed for more autonomy. By the mid-5th century, the Visigothic kingdom was a sovereign power in all but name. Military unity fractured. The presence of foederati armies fighting beside Roman troops, but not under the same command, led to a breakdown in cohesion. In some battles, coordination was poor or absent. In others, foederati troops turned on their Roman allies mid-battle or demanded land and loot before agreeing to fight. This instability culminated in events like the sack of Rome in 410 CE, when Alaric I, leader of the Visigoths who had once fought for Rome, turned his army on the city after failed negotiations. It was not just a military disaster, it was a psychological one. The Eternal City had fallen not to foreign invaders from afar, but to former allies within. The strange case of Stilicho. Consider Stilicho, a Roman general of Vandal descent and one of the last competent commanders of the Western Roman Empire. He relied heavily on foederati to maintain order, especially in Gaul and Italy. Stilicho walked a political tightrope. He married into the imperial family, controlled the armies, and tried to balance Roman tradition with barbarian pragmatism. He even recruited Hunnic mercenaries and Germanic tribes to fight other Germanic tribes. But Roman senators grew suspicious of his foreign ties. In 408 CE, he was executed on charges of treason, after which many of the foederati troops loyal to him defected or mutinied. Rome never fully recovered its military stability. A shifting identity, Roman or barbarian. As these foreign groups became entrenched, the line between Roman and non-Roman blurred. Some foederati adopted Roman dress, language, and religion. Their leaders sought Roman titles dux, magister militum comes. Others retained their tribal customs, speaking Gothic or Frankish and worshipping old gods or later, Arian Christianity. In some cases, the children of foederati entered Roman service as generals or officials. The empire became a hybrid society, linguistically and culturally complex. This was not assimilation as Rome had practiced in earlier centuries. It was mutual influence, often unequal and increasingly dominated by the newcomers. When defense became delegation. By the 440s and 450s, the Western Empire no longer controlled its own defense. Large swaths of Gaul, Hispania, and even parts of Italy were garrisoned not by imperial legions, but by foederati warbands. Decisions about war and peace were made as much in tribal assemblies as in Roman palaces. The empire became reactive. Rather than projecting power, it responded to emergencies, negotiating with Visigothic kings, bribing Huns, and trying to play rival factions against each other. The foederati had been a stopgap measure, but now they were the army. Rome's new reality. In the end, the rise of the foederati marked not just a military change, but a shift in sovereignty. The Western Roman Empire had once prided itself on unity of command, of citizenship, of law. The foederati arrangement fractured that unity. It introduced competing centers of power inside the empire, each with its own interests. And once that precedent was set, it was hard to reverse. The empire did not fall because of a single defeat, but because its heart, the army, was no longer truly Roman. Yet one can't help but ask, when an empire entrusts its own defense to outsiders, at what point does it cease to defend itself at all? By the middle of the 5th century, the foederati system had become a defining feature of the Western Roman Empire's military and political landscape. What had begun as a pragmatic arrangement, inviting outside groups to help bolster a shrinking Roman army, evolved into something far more unstable and transformative. The foederati were no longer just helpers. In many parts of the empire, they were the de facto rulers. A web of fragile agreements. Across the empire, Rome struck deals with a wide range of tribal groups. These were often specific, situational, and short-term in intent, an effort to manage crises as they arose. The Visigoths in Aquitaine, the Franks along the Rhine, the Burgundians in the Rhone Valley, the Alans in central Gaul. Even the Huns, who had once terrorized the borders, were at times engaged as mercenaries. In every case, the principle was the same: land or payment in exchange for military support. But the agreements were not always respected, nor clearly written. Misunderstandings, broken promises, and conflicting interpretations led to conflict. To the Roman government, these tribes were allies. To the tribes, they were independent peoples, engaging in treaties from a position of strength. In reality, no one was entirely in control. The Visigothic power base grows. Among the Foederati, the Visigoths were perhaps the most influential. After settling in Aquitaine, their kings used their position to expand their influence in both Gaul and Hispania. Under King Theodoric I and later Theodoric II, the Visigoths functioned less like imperial clients and more like autonomous rulers. They issued laws, minted coins, and negotiated with both Roman officials and other barbarian groups. Rome tried to maintain diplomatic ties, sometimes appointing Visigothic leaders to official Roman titles such as Magister Militum, Master of Soldiers. These gestures acknowledged Gothic power while attempting to frame it within the Roman hierarchy. But the facade wore thin. In 455 CE, after the assassination of Emperor Valentinian III and the chaotic sack of Rome by the Vandals, Visigothic ambitions sharpened. They began campaigns to take control of Spain, clashing with the Suebi and other regional powers. When Roman officials protested, the Goths reminded them that they were fighting Rome's enemies. It was a claim both true and self-serving. The Vandal disruption in Africa. While the Visigoths secured Gaul and eyed Hispania, another Foederati group had taken a far more aggressive turn. The Vandals, originally from Central Europe, had crossed the Rhine in 406 CE, wandered through Gaul and Hispania, and eventually established a kingdom in North Africa by 439 CE, capturing the wealthy city of Carthage. This was a catastrophic loss for Rome. North Africa had been the empire's breadbasket for centuries. Losing it meant losing vital grain shipments, tax revenue, and naval infrastructure. The Vandals were never meant to be Foederati in Africa. They had not been invited, they had taken what they wanted. But after their conquest, they offered terms suggesting, ironically, a new foedus with Rome in exchange for recognition. The empire, desperate and weakened, at times entertained these discussions, but the relationship was never formalized. The Vandals remained hostile, even launching a devastating naval raid on Rome in 455 CE. This was the danger of Rome's reliance on external forces. When those forces turned against the empire, Rome had no capacity to respond effectively. The blurred lines of authority. With so many Foederati operating semi-independently, the Western Empire's military command became tangled. Imagine a Roman general preparing for battle in Gaul in 460 CE. He must coordinate a depleted Roman field army of citizen soldiers, a contingent of Frankish Foederati, led by a tribal chief with his own agenda, a unit of Hunnic mercenaries, fighting for gold, not loyalty, local militias raised by aristocratic landowners, often poorly trained and ill-equipped. Communication, supply, and strategy were nightmares. Trust was low, and more than once, Foederati commanders took their men and left if they felt slighted, underpaid, or endangered. In some campaigns, Rome was effectively paying rival barbarian groups to fight one another, outsourcing both sides of the conflict. The internal fallout. Within Roman society, especially the senatorial elite, frustration with the Foederati boiled over. To the old Roman aristocracy, the use of barbarian troops signaled the empire's moral and political decay. These were men who had grown up studying Cicero and Virgil, steeped in Roman law and civic duty. Now, they saw the empire's fate tied to chieftains who barely spoke Latin, worshipped Arian Christianity or worse, and ruled by force, not law. Some pushed for reforms. Others withdrew into their estates, effectively isolating themselves from imperial politics. A few, like Sidonius Apollinaris, tried to bridge the gap, serving as both bishop and senator, writing letters that documented the shifting cultural landscape of Gaul. Sidonius once described how hard it was to remain loyal to Rome when Rome itself no longer seemed to know what it stood for. Rome's last hope, Theodoric the Great. A generation later, in the late 5th century, one of the most remarkable foederati commanders would rise to prominence. Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths. Educated in Constantinople, fluent in Latin, and well-versed in Roman political traditions, Theodoric presented a hybrid model, a barbarian ruler who embraced Roman civilization. After years of serving as a foederati leader under the Eastern Roman Empire, he marched into Italy and deposed Odoacer, the man who had himself deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 CE. In 493 CE, Theodoric established the Ostrogothic Kingdom of Italy, ruling in the name of the Eastern Emperor but exercising full autonomy. He preserved Roman laws, employed Roman officials, and even tried to maintain the Senate as a functioning institution. Yet he remained king of the Goths, not emperor of the Romans. His reign, though later complicated by religious and political strife, demonstrated what the foederati experiment had become, not merely a military alliance, but a path to sovereignty. Cultural entanglement. By this point, the cultural entanglement between Romans and foederati was irreversible. Latin remained the lingua franca, but regional dialects evolved. Roman law was referenced in barbarian codes like the Lex Visigothorum and Lex Burgundianum. Cities maintained Roman layouts, but saw churches replace basilicas. Roman aristocrats intermarried with Gothic nobility. Barbarian rulers adopted Roman titles rex, patricius, consul even as they ruled independently. This was not a conquest, it was a transformation. The foederati had not destroyed the Roman Empire, they had inherited it. The loss of military sovereignty. The core truth, however, remained. The Western Roman Empire no longer controlled its own army. It could not raise, supply, or deploy troops without negotiating with foreign kings. It could not defend its cities, police its provinces, or enforce its will without reliance on tribal warbands whose loyalty was often conditional and fleeting. This loss of military sovereignty preceded and perhaps guaranteed the collapse of political sovereignty. Without a reliable army, the empire could no longer be an empire. A new map emerges. By 470 CE, the map of the West had changed dramatically. The Visigoths ruled southwestern Gaul and most of Hispania. The Franks had expanded into northern Gaul. The Burgundians controlled the Rhone Valley. The Vandals dominated North Africa and the western Mediterranean Sea. The Suebi held Galicia in northwestern Spain. The Ostrogoths prepared to seize Italy. All had been foederati. None now saw themselves as Roman subjects. Rome had hired its successors. What makes this moment in history particularly poignant is that Rome's collapse was facilitated not by external conquest alone, but by internal strategy. In outsourcing its defense to the foederati, the empire unintentionally trained, armed, and legitimized the very powers that would replace it. Foederati kings built their legitimacy on Roman precedent. They governed Roman land, employed Roman laws, and claimed Roman virtues. And yet, they were not Roman emperors. They were something new. And so we are left to consider. When a state trains others to guard its gates, does it also teach them how to take its throne? As the 5th century faded and the 6th century dawned, the Western Roman Empire was no longer a unified political entity, but a patchwork of successor kingdoms. The foederati system, originally a tool of survival, had become the very mechanism by which Rome ceded control of the West. But these were not the ashes of collapse alone. They were also the seeds of transformation. The legacy of the foederati was complex. It signaled both the end of Roman political hegemony in the West and the beginning of a medieval world deeply shaped by Roman ideas, institutions, and laws carried forward, paradoxically, by the very peoples who had once stood outside its walls. The new kingdoms of the West. By the year 500 CE, Western Europe looked remarkably different from the days of Augustus or Constantine. The foederati had carved out new realms. The Visigothic kingdom controlled most of Hispania and southern Gaul. The Burgundians held sway in southeastern Gaul. The Franks, under Clovis I, had unified much of northern Gaul and were rising fast. The Vandals remained in North Africa, raiding Roman seas and clashing with Constantinople. The Ostrogoths, under Theodoric the Great, ruled Italy in the name of the Eastern Roman Emperor, but as practical kings in their own right. Each of these kingdoms had started at some point as a foederati group, a guest in the Roman house. By 500, they were the new landlords. And yet they did not erase Rome. In many ways, they sought to preserve and appropriate it. Theodoric's Rome, a hybrid ideal. Nowhere was this more visible than in the reign of Theodoric the Great in Italy, r. 493-526. A Gothic king educated in Constantinople, Theodoric saw himself as a restorer of Roman greatness despite being the leader of a so-called barbarian people. He maintained Roman institutions, honored the Senate, funded infrastructure repairs, and preserved Roman law for his Roman subjects. He even used imperial titles and dated his edicts by the reigns of the Eastern Roman emperors. His own court was a cultural crossroads. He retained Roman advisors like Cassiodorus and fostered intellectual life. His government issued documents in Latin, respected traditional Roman administration, and ruled from Ravenna, a city of mosaics and Roman dignity. Yet he was always undeniably a Gothic king. His Gothic subjects were ruled by Gothic law. He was not emperor and never claimed to be. In Theodoric's Italy, two legal systems and two peoples coexisted, Romans and Goths, side by side. This duality, foreign king, Roman court, captured the essence of the foederati legacy. Not destruction, but complex cohabitation. Foederati law and legacy. The former foederati kingdoms began codifying laws to manage diverse populations. These legal codes often retained Roman influence while adapting to local customs. The Lex Visigothorum, also called the Breviary of Alaric, preserved Roman law for Roman subjects within the Visigothic kingdom. The Lex Burgundianum did the same in the Burgundian realm, explicitly distinguishing between Roman and Burgundian populations. Later, the Lex Salica, issued by the Franks, moved further from Roman tradition, but still bore its imprint in terms of administration and legal process. This two-tiered legal structure, one for Romans, one for barbarians, persisted for generations before gradually blending into unified codes. Yet its very existence reflects how seriously these new rulers took their Roman inheritance. Language, culture, and the Christian Church. Though the Western Empire collapsed politically, Latin survived and even thrived in its former territories. It remained the language of law, administration, and the church. It was spoken in courts, preached in churches, and recorded in manuscripts. Over time, it evolved into vernaculars: early French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, but its Roman core endured. The church, too, was a critical vessel of Roman continuity. As foederati kings converted to Christianity, sometimes from Arianism to Nicene Orthodoxy, they found a unifying institutional partner in the Catholic Church. The Franks' conversion under Clovis I was especially momentous. Unlike the Visigoths and Vandals, who initially followed Arian Christianity, seen as heretical by Roman standards, Clovis embraced Catholicism. This aligned him with the Roman majority in Gaul and secured the support of the Gallic clergy. In this way, the Church became the great reconciler between Roman tradition and Germanic rulership. From mercenaries to monarchs, it is important to recognize just how far the foederati had come from allies on the empire's fringes to rulers of its former provinces. They learned diplomacy from Roman envoys. They adopted Roman-style administration and titles. They inherited Roman buildings, cities, and civic traditions. They married into Roman aristocracy. They even minted coins with imperial imagery. Over time, the original foedus agreements faded into memory. What had begun as temporary, conditional military contracts transformed into sovereign political structures. The line between Rome and its guests was no longer a border, it was a blur. The Eastern Empire's frustrated hopes. While the Western Roman Empire disintegrated, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, looked on with a mixture of sorrow, strategy, and superiority. The emperors in Constantinople did not recognize the legitimacy of the Western foederati kingdoms. They often continued to claim sovereignty over lost Western provinces, at least on parchment. Theodoric the Great's rule, for example, was tolerated because it maintained a facade of imperial unity. But the East was never able to restore full control. Even the military campaigns of Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century, intended to reclaim Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain, were temporary, costly, and ultimately unsustainable. The foederati world had become too entrenched, too localized, too distinct to be folded back into a centralized imperial framework. The final disappearance of the foederati label. By the 6th century, the word foederati had largely fallen out of use. The tribal groups once called by that name were now simply kings, dukes, or counts, figures of local power. Their origins as foreign auxiliaries had faded into dynastic legitimacy. The Franks under Clovis, for example, did not rule as foederati, they ruled as a Christian kingdom, fully sovereign. The same was true for the Visigoths in Toledo, the Burgundians in Lyon, and the Ostrogoths in Ravenna. The Roman Empire had not been conquered in the way that Carthage had been. It had been inherited, adapted, and repurposed by the very peoples it had once sought to control. What the foederati revealed about Rome. The story of the foederati is ultimately a story about adaptation, necessity, and unintended consequence. Rome had long relied on assimilation. Its ability to absorb other cultures, peoples, and customs was one of its strengths, but in its final centuries, that process changed. Assimilation gave way to dependency. Integration became accommodation. Power was delegated because there was no other choice. And when those outsiders began to think like Romans, read Roman law, wear Roman garments, mint Roman coins, they also began to act like Roman rulers. The tools Rome had used to sustain itself in crisis became the blueprints for its replacement. Echoes in today's world. There's a quiet relevance to this story, even centuries later. Modern empires and nation-states, too, rely on alliances, proxy forces, outsourced defense, and complex diplomacy. The story of the foederati reminds us that short-term solutions can shape long-term outcomes, that power handed away in crisis may never fully return. It also reminds us that culture, law, and language can survive political collapse. The foederati did not erase Rome, they carried parts of it forward, albeit in new forms. In the end, perhaps the real legacy of the foederati is not that they helped bring down the Roman Empire, but that they helped ensure it never entirely disappeared. And so we are left with one final question. If Rome lived on through the very people who replaced it, did it ever truly fall? Story 3, Alaric and the Sack of Rome, a barbarian's bargain. In the long twilight of the Western Roman Empire, few figures loom as large or as misunderstood as Alaric, king of the Visigoths. Often remembered only as the man who sacked Rome in 410 CE, Alaric was more than a marauder. He was a soldier, a negotiator, a Christian, and a commander shaped by Roman institutions and limitations. His famous attack on the Eternal City was not the reckless violence of an outsider. It was the culmination of years of broken promises, frustrated diplomacy, and an increasingly unsteady imperial system that had made many bargains and kept few. To understand the sack of Rome, we must begin not in blood and fire, but in loyalty and service. The young Gothic recruit. Alaric was likely born around 370 CE, a child of the Turving Goths, later known simply as Visigoths, who had recently been allowed to settle within the Eastern Roman Empire. These Gothic groups had fled westward under pressure from the Huns, whose lightning-fast raids had disrupted centuries of tribal life beyond the Danube. After a disastrous entry into the empire in 376, and the subsequent Battle of Adrianople in 378, where Emperor Valens was killed, the Goths had been grudgingly settled in the Balkans. From that moment, their relationship with Rome was complex. Both guests and threats, they were watched, taxed, employed, and often underpaid. It was in this ambiguous context that Alaric came of age. He was literate in Roman customs and likely spoke Latin or Greek. He was also Christian, though of the Arian persuasion, like many Goths, which set him apart from the Nicene orthodoxy of most Roman bishops and elites. But most importantly, he served in the Roman military. A Roman soldier by another name. In the late 4th century, the Roman army was increasingly reliant on Gothic and other Germanic recruits. Alaric first emerges in the historical record as a commander of Gothic auxiliaries serving under the Roman general Theodosius, a man remembered as the last emperor to rule both east and west. Alaric may have fought at the Battle of the Frigidus River in 394 CE, where Theodosius defeated the usurper Eugenius. The battle was costly, and Gothic soldiers Alaric's comrades suffered immense losses. Roman generals had a reputation for using Gothic troops as frontline fodder. This memory would stay with Alaric. In later years, he referenced the betrayal and mistreatment of Gothic soldiers sent to die for an empire that never truly accepted them. The dissolution of unity. When Theodosius died in 395 CE, the empire was split between his two sons. Arcadius in the east, Constantinople. Honorius in the west, Milan, later Ravenna. Alaric, still a military leader, found himself caught between two halves of a fractured empire. He had no formal title, no Roman office, yet he commanded thousands of Gothic warriors, loyal not to Rome, but to him personally. Sensing opportunity, Alaric was proclaimed king by his people, an unusual step for Goths within the empire. He began asserting his own authority, demanding better pay, recognition, and a formal military post in the Roman hierarchy. The Romans refused. Raiding in the east. Rebuffed by imperial officials, Alaric took matters into his own hands. In the late 390s, he led his forces through Thrace, Macedonia, and into Greece, sacking cities and threatening Athens. This was not mere plunder, it was a bargaining tactic. Alaric hoped to pressure the Eastern court into granting him a military title and a permanent home for his people. Eventually, the Eastern government agreed to a compromise. Around 398 CE, Alaric was named Magister Militum per Illyricum, Master of Soldiers for the Balkan region. It was not the position he wanted, nor was it stable, but it was something. His Goths settled in Illyricum, farming and resting. But this peace would not last. The court of Ravenna and the rise of Stilicho. Meanwhile, in the west, politics was in chaos. Emperor Honorius, still a teenager, was under the control of the powerful general Stilicho, a Roman of partly Vandal origin. Stilicho wielded real power, enforcing Roman control in Italy, Gaul, and Spain. He saw Alaric not as an enemy, but as a potential asset. There is some evidence that Stilicho encouraged Alaric to move westward into northern Italy, to apply pressure on the Eastern court in Constantinople. The idea was to use Alaric's military presence to force concessions in the ongoing dispute between the Eastern and Western empires. But the plan backfired. Alaric crossed into Italy in 401 CE, initiating a period of sustained tension with the West. Though eventually repelled at the Battle of Palencia in 402, he was not destroyed, and his presence remained a thorn in the side of the Roman court, which had now relocated to the more defensible city of Ravenna. Negotiation, betrayal, and a changing Rome. In the following years, Alaric would engage in a pattern that would become familiar. Enter Roman territory. Negotiate for food, payment, or titles. Face rejection. Apply military pressure. Negotiate again. He did not seek the destruction of Rome. He wanted recognition both for himself and for his people, a permanent homeland, a formal place in the imperial hierarchy, security. But the Roman government was increasingly fragmented and unreliable. When agreements were reached, they were often not honored. When treaties were broken, Alaric responded with force. In 408, events escalated dramatically. The assassination of Stilicho. That year, Stilicho, the only Roman general who had ever treated with Alaric in good faith, was assassinated by political rivals in Ravenna. Along with him, thousands of foederati troops were massacred across Italy in a wave of anti-Gothic violence. Alaric saw this as not just betrayal, but declaration of war. He marshaled his forces and marched directly on Rome. It was the first time in over 800 years that the city would face a siege. Siege without fire. In 408-409, Alaric laid siege to Rome, but it was not the fiery assault of legend. Instead, he used starvation and fear to compel the Senate to negotiate. Rome, once the capital of the empire, was now largely ceremonial. The emperor resided in Ravenna. The city still held symbolic power but little military value. The Senate, desperate, negotiated with Alaric. A ransom was paid, 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, thousands of silk garments, hides of dyed leather, and tons of pepper. Wealth was stripped from temples, statues, and private homes. Alaric lifted the siege, but he was not done. He demanded that Honorius name him Magister Utriusque Militiae, master of both services, one of the highest Roman military offices. The emperor refused. The puppet emperor. In 409, Alaric did something unprecedented. He installed a puppet emperor, Priscus Attalus, a Roman senator hoping to pressure Honorius into negotiation. But the experiment failed. Attalus lacked authority and support. After a few months, Alaric deposed him himself. By 410, Alaric again sought talks with Honorius. Once more he was rejected. And so, with no clear path, no honest partner, and no lasting settlement, he made a decision that would echo through history. He would sack Rome. A city opened, not burned. On August 24, 410 CE, Alaric's forces entered the city through the Salarian Gate, reportedly opened from the inside by sympathetic slaves or guards. But what followed was not wholesale slaughter. Alaric had instructed his men not to destroy churches. Most buildings were spared. There was looting, yes, but it was measured. Pagan temples were stripped, private villas raided, but the destruction was not total. In fact, the sack lasted only 3 days. Then Alaric and his army moved on, heading south, perhaps toward Sicily, possibly dreaming of crossing into Africa. But fate had other plans. Later that year, Alaric died, likely of illness, near the town of Cosenza in southern Italy. According to legend, His followers diverted a river to bury him beneath its bed, then killed the laborers to keep the location secret. The aftermath, a world that had shifted. Rome had not fallen in 410, but it had changed. The sack was a psychological blow. It shattered the myth of Rome's invincibility. Pagans saw it as punishment for abandoning the old gods. Christians, like St. Augustine, wrote works like The City of God to explain how such an event could happen in a supposedly Christian world. But for the Goths and for Alaric's successors, it marked a turning point. No longer outsiders, they were now arbiters of power. Within a generation, the Visigoths would settle in Gaul as foederati, eventually founding their own kingdom. Alaric never got the official Roman post he sought, but his actions ensured that future Gothic leaders wouldn't need one. And so, as we think of Alaric, we must ask, was he Rome's enemy, or simply the man who finally made it listen too late? After Alaric's Gothic forces sacked Rome in August of 410 CE, the ancient world shuddered not just from the violence, but from what it symbolized. A power long seen as eternal had proven vulnerable. Yet what may be more compelling than the act itself was what came before it. A protracted, frustrating, and ultimately failed negotiation between Alaric and an empire that no longer knew how to keep its promises. Alaric's decision to attack Rome was not inevitable. In fact, it was a last resort after years of complex diplomacy, political betrayal, and shifting alliances. The sack was not just about conquest, it was about legitimacy denied. To fully understand this, we must examine the years between 408 and 410 CE when Alaric, standing at the edge of the empire, held out his hand and was ignored. The death of Stilicho and the unraveling of trust. The Roman general Stilicho, once the most powerful man in the Western Empire, was executed in August 408. His fall left a power vacuum that no one could effectively fill. To Alaric, Stilicho had been a difficult figure, but a consistent one. He was willing to negotiate. With him gone, the new regime in Ravenna distrusted all foederati, including Alaric, and launched purges against Goths living within Roman territory. Thousands of Gothic soldiers who had served loyally in the Roman army were hunted down and killed. Families were slaughtered. Those who survived fled to Alaric's camp. What had once been a military unit became a movement. Alaric was no longer just a general, he was a protector, a leader of a people wronged. Rome, through its violence, had radicalized its own allies. Alaric's demands, not plunder but position. Contrary to popular imagination, Alaric's demands were not outrageous. In his initial messages to Emperor Honorius, he asked for recognition as Magister Militum, master of soldiers, a promise of regular pay for his troops, a suitable territory for his people to settle, preferably in Noricum or Pannonia, basic provisions for his followers. These were moderate terms, especially considering he commanded a disciplined force capable of marching on any city in Italy. Yet they were dismissed out of hand. Why? Because the court at Ravenna was divided. Some saw Alaric as a barbarian threat to be eliminated. Others feared granting him legitimacy would encourage similar demands from other groups. Honorius himself, young, indecisive, and heavily influenced by shifting advisors, waffled, delayed, and ultimately refused meaningful engagement. The Siege of Rome, Round 1. In the fall of 408, with no imperial response, Alaric marched on Rome and laid siege to the city. He blocked grain shipments from Africa, starved the population, and waited. Inside the city, panic spread. Food ran out. The price of a loaf of bread skyrocketed. Reports of cannibalism circulated, though we can't know for certain if they were true or imperial propaganda. The Senate, stripped of power but still a symbol of Roman tradition, tried to negotiate independently. They sent envoys to Alaric. He asked for a vast ransom in gold, silver, cloth, and spices. When told that such a price would leave the city impoverished, he famously replied, "The thicker the hay, the easier it is mowed." Eventually, the Senate complied, stripping pagan temples of wealth to meet the demands. Alaric, satisfied but still without recognition, lifted the siege. But the deeper issues remained. A puppet on a crumbling stage, Priscus Attalus. Alaric, frustrated by Ravenna's silence, made a bold move. He installed a rival emperor in Rome. In late 409 CE, the Senate proclaimed Priscus Attalus, a respected Roman nobleman, as emperor backed by Gothic force. Alaric believed that with Attalus on the throne, they could bypass Honorius and build a new Roman-Gothic alliance. Attalus appointed ministers. Alaric was made Magister Utriusque Militiae. A Gothic Roman regime ruled the city. But Attalus quickly proved ineffective. He refused to negotiate with Honorius or grant Alaric's request to resettle the Goths. He alienated both Romans and Goths by trying to play imperial politics from a weakened position. By summer 410, Alaric had had enough. He stripped Attalus of his title and tried once more to deal with Honorius. Ravenna's response: reinforcements, not reconciliation. Alaric's envoys arrived in Ravenna. The emperor again refused his requests, perhaps emboldened by the arrival of Eastern Roman reinforcements, or simply out of distrust. Then, in a final symbolic insult, a Roman official named Cyrus, a longtime Gothic rival of Alaric, attacked a contingent of Alaric's forces during peace talks. It was not a major battle, but it was the final straw. Alaric had attempted diplomacy, installed a Roman emperor, offered his sword in service, and held his hand out in negotiation. And the empire had responded with silence, mockery, and violence. The sack of Rome, not a fall but a signal. On August 24, 410, Alaric's army approached the Salarian Gate. Whether opened by insiders or breached through force is uncertain, but within hours the Goths were in the city. There was looting, yes, but no widespread slaughter. Alaric had given orders: respect the churches. St. Peter's and St. Paul's were declared sanctuaries. Many Romans took refuge inside. Some homes were pillaged, others left untouched. The wealth of centuries was carted away: gold, statues, cloth, treasures from temples both pagan and Christian. Noblewomen were taken as hostages or wives. The most famous of these was Galla Placidia, half-sister of Honorius, who would go on to play a major role in future imperial politics. But there was no fire, no mass destruction, no barbaric frenzy. Instead, there was method, a calculated show of force, a punishment perhaps, but more deeply, a statement. Rome could no longer ignore the people on its borders. It could no longer pretend to rule without compromise. What Rome lost and what it didn't. The sack of 410 was the first in 800 years. It shocked the Roman world, but in material terms, it was not fatal. The Senate still met, the church still operated, the empire still issued coins, passed laws, and appointed governors. But the myth was broken. The aura of invincibility, the idea of eternal Roman dominance, it lay in pieces. In the East, the reaction was one of pity and distance. Rome was no longer the capital of the empire it hadn't been for decades. Constantinople saw itself as the true heir of civilization now. In the West, however, the sack had a chilling effect. Pagan writers like Zosimus blamed the Christians. Christian thinkers like Augustine penned theological responses, such as the City of God, to explain how Rome's fall did not mean God's abandonment. But for the average Roman citizen, especially those who watched the Gothic army calmly march away, after 3 days the message was simpler. The empire no longer protected them. Alaric's final march. After the sack, Alaric moved south. His goal: to sail to Africa, the breadbasket of the West. Control of North Africa meant control of grain. It would give him leverage. But storms thwarted his fleet. The journey was delayed, and before he could try again, Alaric fell ill. In late 410 or early 411 CE, Alaric died near the town of Cosenza in Calabria. His followers buried him according to legend beneath the riverbed of the Busento River, its course diverted for the funeral and returned to cover the tomb. The laborers who dug the grave, the story goes, were all killed to keep its location secret. Whatever the truth, Alaric's passing marked the end of a chapter. He had never sought Rome's destruction. He had sought integration, partnership, recognition. Rome denied him all three. Legacy of a negotiator. In the years that followed, the Visigoths would settle in Aquitaine as foederati, founding a kingdom that would outlast the Western Empire itself. Their leaders learned from Alaric's experience. They negotiated harder, demanded more, and compromised less. The days of Gothic patience were over. Meanwhile, Rome continued its slow disintegration, less from war and more from institutional decay. The sack had been a symptom, not a cause. Alaric, once labeled a barbarian invader, now looks more like a mediator failed by a crumbling state. So we must ask, with hindsight in a quieter tone, was the sack of Rome an act of aggression or a last, unanswered appeal to an empire no longer capable of listening? When Alaric's body was quietly laid to rest beneath the waters of the Busento River, the man who had once commanded Rome's fate vanished from the stage of history. Yet his actions continued to echo across the empire and into the centuries that followed. The sack of Rome in 410 CE was not merely a turning point in the Western Roman Empire's decline. It was a moment that reshaped the way Roman identity, security, and sovereignty were understood. More than a violent act, the sack was a political earthquake. It didn't destroy the Western Empire overnight, but it shifted the foundations so profoundly that recovery, in any recognizable form, was impossible. Life in Rome after the sack. Surprisingly, Rome did not vanish in the aftermath of 410. The city still functioned. The Senate still convened. Daily life resumed in the quieter, emptier streets. But it was not the same Rome. Estimates suggest that by the early 5th century, Rome's population had already declined from over 1 million at its peak to perhaps 200,000. After the sack, more citizens fled, especially the aristocracy. Many wealthy families relocated permanently to southern Italy or to estates in Africa or Gaul. Buildings damaged or looted during the sack were not all rebuilt. The economic strain was too great. Some temples, never restored, were repurposed into churches or abandoned altogether. The city began to physically shrink. Districts fell into disuse. Aqueducts, long neglected, broke down. Grain shipments from Africa became irregular or stopped entirely. Rome remained important symbolically, but it was no longer the heart of the empire. That center had shifted, first to Milan, then to Ravenna, and increasingly toward Constantinople. Rome, once the capital of the known world, had become a shadow of its former self. The rise of Galla Placidia. One unexpected legacy of the sack was the rise of Galla Placidia, half-sister of Emperor Honorius. Captured by Alaric's forces during the sack, she was treated with respect and later married to Ataulf, Alaric's brother-in-law and successor as Visigothic king. Their union was both symbolic and strategic, a bridge between the Roman imperial family and the rising Gothic power. In 414 CE, they had a son, Theodosius, whose birth many hoped would symbolize a new Romano-Gothic dynasty. Unfortunately, the child died young, and Ataulf was assassinated soon after. But Galla Placidia returned to Roman politics. She later married Constantius III, a Roman general, and served as regent for her son, Valentinian III, during his minority. From 423 to 437 CE, she effectively ruled the Western Empire, an imperial authority who had once lived among the Goths. Her experience straddling both worlds symbolized a broader truth. The lines between Roman and barbarian were no longer clear. Rome's changing psychological landscape. To many Roman elites, the sack of 410 was not just a political event, it was a cosmic one. It marked the unraveling of a worldview. Pagans saw it as punishment for abandoning the old gods. The temples of Jupiter and Mars, once glorious, had failed to protect the city. Even Christian churches, though spared by Alaric, could not stop the invasion. Christians, too, were shaken. How could God allow the holy city to fall? In response, Augustine of Hippo began writing The City of God, a monumental work that argued Rome was not the true city of God, and that its earthly fall did not signal divine failure. Instead, he pointed believers to a higher, spiritual realm beyond political systems. This shift was profound. Augustine's work helped Christianize the concept of history itself. Rome was no longer the moral and political center of the universe, it was a way station in a larger, divine plan. Alaric in Gothic memory. To the Goths, Alaric was a founder. Though his attempt to reach Africa failed and his life ended in southern Italy, he had done what no Gothic leader before him had achieved. He forced the Roman Empire to recognize the power and autonomy of the Visigoths. His successor, Ataulf, would carry the Visigoths into a new phase, settling in Gaul and later Hispania as foederati of Rome, and eventually as fully independent rulers. Within the Gothic oral tradition passed down through generations, Alaric became a figure of dignity and strength, not destruction. A man who tried to work with Rome but was repeatedly denied his place. Later historians, such as Jordanes, a 6th century Gothic writer, portrayed him with a tone of respect. He was remembered not as a savage, but as a warrior king caught between worlds. The myth of the sack. Over time, the sack of Rome in 410 became a symbolic turning point in European memory, an event often misrepresented, misunderstood, and mythologized. In popular imagination, especially during the Middle Ages and Renaissance, the sack became conflated with apocalyptic imagery. Poets and chroniclers wrote of flames, mass slaughter, and divine judgment, even though the actual sack had been relatively restrained. Later historians would frame it as the fall of Rome, despite the fact that the Western Empire would linger for another 66 years. The truth is more subtle and perhaps more unsettling. Rome fell not because of one sack or one king, but because it could no longer sustain the institutions that had once held it together. The sack was not the cause but the symptom. The broader shift in Roman identity. Alaric's rise and the sack he led are best understood not simply as the story of a barbarian raid, but as a chapter in Rome's transformation. By the early 5th century, Roman identity was already changing. The army was no longer Roman in composition, it was mostly Gothic, Frankish, or Hunnic. The imperial court relied on foreign generals for defense. Roman citizenship had been granted widely after 212 CE, making it more a legal status than a cultural one. The church had become the primary institution of Roman continuity. The Senate was weak, urban life was shrinking, and regional aristocrats held real power. Into this world stepped Alaric not to destroy it, but to claim a share in it. And the empire, too divided to respond, left him with no choice but to take it by force. The long-term impact of the sack. While the 410 sack didn't end Rome, it did have major consequences. It weakened confidence in the Western Empire's ability to defend its cities. It encouraged other groups, like the Vandals, to test Rome's defenses. In fact, the Vandals would sack Rome themselves in 455. It forced the Roman elite to rethink their identity, paving the way for deeper Christianization and decentralization. It solidified the Visigoths' role as a permanent fixture in Western politics. Most of all, it revealed that Rome's authority was conditional, dependent on diplomacy, resources, and military control that it no longer possessed. Alaric's real victory. Alaric never received the Roman title he sought. He never secured a permanent homeland for his people during his lifetime. He died without seeing the Visigoths integrated into the empire as equals. And yet, his legacy outlasted most of his Roman counterparts. Within decades, the Visigothic kingdom would be among the most powerful in the West. Based first in Toulouse, then later in Toledo, it would preserve Roman law, administration, and Christian faith even as it governed independently. Alaric's dream of Gothic legitimacy within a Roman framework became real, just not in the way he had imagined. The Gothic bargain. In the end, Alaric's story is not one of mere conquest or destruction. It is a bargain unfulfilled. He offered loyalty, service, and military strength to a crumbling empire. What he asked for in return was not conquest, but coexistence. Rome's failure to accept that bargain in time, in good faith, and with foresight was not just Alaric's tragedy. It was its own. And so we might ask, with quiet reflection, what if the empire had said yes? Could Rome have survived not by resisting the Goths, but by embracing them? Story 4. The Ghost of Diocletian. Bureaucracy, Reform, and Ruin. In the long history of Rome, few emperors left as deep and lasting an imprint as Diocletian. Yet his legacy is paradoxical. He did not cause the fall of the Roman Empire, but in many ways, he laid the bureaucratic foundations that shaped how it would survive, fracture, and eventually collapse. Born to humble origins around 244 CE, Diocletian rose through the ranks of the military during a time of chaos. The mid-3rd century was a period of almost constant crisis: civil wars, barbarian invasions, plagues, and economic collapse. Emperors came and went with alarming speed. Few reigned more than a couple of years before being murdered or overthrown. When Diocletian took power in 284 CE, he recognized something crucial. The empire, as it was, could no longer be governed by a single man. His answer: reform everything, split the empire, expand the bureaucracy, secure the borders, regulate the economy. And for a time it worked. But beneath the administrative brilliance lay the seeds of unintended consequence. For in attempting to save Rome, Diocletian transformed it into something new, something that would endure, but at great cost. The Tetrarchy: 4 emperors, 1 empire. Perhaps Diocletian's most radical innovation was the Tetrarchy, a system of government in which power was divided among 4 rulers. 2 Augusti, senior emperors. 2 Caesars, junior emperors and successors in training. Diocletian himself became Augustus of the East, ruling from Nicomedia, modern-day Turkey. His co-emperor Maximian ruled the West from Milan. Their chosen Caesars, Constantius Chlorus in Gaul and Galerius in the Balkans, completed the leadership circle. Each ruler governed a specific portion of the empire, with their own court, army, and administrative apparatus. The idea was to ensure faster response times to invasions, quicker administration of justice, and a clear succession plan to avoid civil wars. It was, on paper, a masterpiece of political engineering. But while the system prevented civil war for a time, it also institutionalized division. No longer was the empire a single, unified entity. Power was shared and potentially contested. What began as a practical fix would, by the 4th and 5th centuries, become a permanent east-west divide, one that Rome would never fully heal. The new bureaucracy: bigger, heavier, slower. Alongside the Tetrarchy came a massive expansion of the imperial bureaucracy. Diocletian believed that control required clarity: more officials, more offices, more reports, more surveillance. He divided provinces into smaller units, called dioceses, each governed by a vicarius under a praetorian prefect. The result was hundreds of civil administrators spread across the empire, each overseeing smaller and more localized populations. This reorganization brought some benefits: more direct oversight, improved record keeping, and better tax collection. But it also led to bureaucratic bloat. The imperial government became labyrinthine. Decisions required layers of approval. Local governors had to communicate through channels of vicariae, prefects, and emperors. The system could track grain shipments and census records, but it could not move quickly. Flexibility gave way to procedure. And the people, especially the rural poor, began to feel the weight. Taxation, efficient, exhausting, eternal. To support this expanded administration, and a larger, more permanent military, Diocletian overhauled the tax system. Taxes were now assessed based on a complex formula called the capitatio eugatio, which calculated obligations based on land, iugum, and labor, caput. Every field, vineyard, orchard, and head of livestock was counted. Every working adult was registered. It was methodical, it was predictable, and it was crushing. Tax collectors, called exactors or curials, were responsible for meeting quotas, regardless of actual harvests. If a village suffered a bad year, it still owed full payment. If a peasant could not pay, the local landowner was liable. If the landowner failed, he might face seizure of assets or his family might be conscripted for labor. Taxation became a form of control as much as revenue. To avoid financial ruin, many peasants gave up land ownership entirely, becoming coloni semi-free tenant farmers bound to the land. Over time, this system would evolve into medieval serfdom. Diocletian's tax reforms made the empire solvent again, but at the price of freedom, flexibility, and rural stability. Price controls and economic rigidity. Rome's economy in the late 3rd century was in shambles. Debasement of currency had caused inflation. Soldiers were demanding payment in gold. Merchants hiked prices to account for unreliable coinage. In response, Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 CE, a sweeping attempt to regulate inflation by capping the prices of over 1,000 goods and services. From wheat to wool, beer to bricklaying, everything had a fixed legal price. The intent was noble, the result was chaos. Merchants stopped selling at a loss. Black markets flourished. Punishments for price gouging were severe: fines, exile, even death, but enforcement was nearly impossible. The edict ultimately failed and was quietly abandoned. What lingered was the idea that economic activity could be legislated, that government control should shape daily life down to the smallest transaction. It was a principle the later empire would cling to, even as its systems became more rigid and disconnected from reality. Identity and loyalty in a transformed empire. Under Diocletian, the Roman world began to feel less like a republican memory and more like an imperial machine. The emperor was no longer the first among equals, princeps. He was now dominus et deus, Lord and God. His court became ceremonial, his presence rare and awe-inspiring. Purple robes, jeweled diadems, prostration, all borrowed from Eastern monarchies, became symbols of power. This new dominate, as historians call the post-285 CE empire, expected submission, not participation. For the average Roman subject, this meant less influence over government, more bureaucracy in daily life, and a deepening divide between ruler and ruled. Some accepted this as necessary. Others withdrew from civic life. The urban aristocracy, once the backbone of Roman governance, increasingly retreated into private estates and personal wealth. Political engagement was replaced by survival strategies. The Roman identity was still strong, but it was no longer empowering. It was heavy, obligatory, controlled. Religion and the last great persecution. One of Diocletian's most controversial acts was his attempt to restore Roman religious unity through a harsh persecution of Christians. In 303 CA, he issued a series of edicts. Christian scriptures were to be burned, churches destroyed, clergy arrested, Christian officials stripped of rank. This was not mere cruelty, it was Diocletian's effort to unify the empire under the old gods, believing religious diversity was fracturing loyalty to the state. The campaign backfired. It caused internal dissent, widespread suffering, and ultimately greater sympathy for Christians. After Diocletian's retirement in 305 CE, one of the only emperors to voluntarily step down, his successors reversed the policy. Within a decade, Constantine the Great would legalize Christianity. Within a century, it would become Rome's official religion. Diocletian's persecution had failed, but his administrative mindset lived on. Retirement had split, a ghost watching Rome. After 20 years in power, Diocletian retired to a lavish palace in Split, in modern-day Croatia, where he famously cultivated cabbages and refused to return to power despite multiple pleas. His reforms had, in many ways, succeeded. The frontiers were more secure. The army was better organized. Tax revenue was stable. The empire had not collapsed. But the cost was immense: political division, economic regimentation, and the loss of civic freedom. His successors inherited an empire that was more durable, but also more fragile in its complexity. Systems that had once relied on participation and adaptation now demanded obedience and order. In trying to save the Roman state, Diocletian had created a version of it that could only function under pressure, and that would eventually buckle when flexibility was most needed. And so we are left with a question, not of intent, but of consequence. Can an empire preserve itself through control, if that control eventually smothers the very life it seeks to protect? Diocletian's system, rational, hierarchical, vast, was built for permanence. It aimed to prevent military anarchy, stabilize taxes, and enforce uniformity across a sprawling empire. And for a time, it did. But by the middle of the 4th century, the machine he created had grown heavier than even he could have imagined. As Rome's flexibility eroded under layers of process, regulation, and fear, the very structures designed to keep the empire upright became burdens to those they governed. We'll explore how Diocletian's legacy lived on twisting, mutating, and eventually helping to paralyze the Western Empire's ability to respond to its many crises. The administrative Leviathan. After Diocletian's retirement in 305 CE, his successors did not dismantle the tetrarchy or his reforms, they refined them. Under Constantine the Great, the split between East and West became functionally permanent, even as emperors paid lip service to unity. Constantine dissolved the tetrarchy but retained the expanded bureaucracy, further dividing civil and military authority. Now, provincial governors handled taxation and justice, while duces, dukes, or comites, counts, commanded local troops. This was designed to prevent rebellion. If no one man controlled both military and civil power in a region, he couldn't easily challenge the emperor. But it also slowed decision-making. Local problems required coordination between multiple officials. Response times lagged, authority blurred. By the 5th century, the administrative map of the empire was dense with overlapping jurisdictions. Praetorian prefects oversaw large regions. Vicari supervised dioceses. Governors managed provinces. Curials administered cities. Exactors enforced tax collection. A single request, say, relief from a tax quota due to crop failure, could pass through a half-dozen offices before receiving an answer. Often the answer came too late, or not at all. This was not corruption in the traditional sense, it was overregulation. The machine ran, but it ran slowly. Too slowly for a world that was changing rapidly. The curse of the curials. Perhaps no group suffered more from Diocletian's reforms than the curials members of the municipal councils in cities and towns across the empire. Originally a position of civic pride, curial office had become a hereditary obligation by the 4th century. Members were expected to collect taxes from the local population, pay shortfalls from their own pocket if quotas weren't met, fund public works and festivals, enforce imperial edicts locally, all without pay. As the empire's economy faltered and imperial demands grew more rigid, curial obligations became ruinous. Many curials fled their posts, joined the church, which was exempt, or renounced their wealth to escape civic duty. The state responded by making the position hereditary and punishing evasion. A curial could not leave his city. He could not become a monk. He could not be ordained without imperial approval. In some towns, the curial class collapsed entirely, and the church or private landowners stepped in to run basic administration. The civic backbone of the empire, its local elite, had been broken by duty. A tax system that could not bend. Diocletian's system of predictable, scheduled taxation worked well in theory. The state knew in advance how much it could collect. Army pay, grain distribution, and infrastructure budgets could be planned. But the real world is rarely predictable. When plagues struck or floods ruined harvests or raiders burned fields, the tax demands did not change. The quotas were fixed. Local officials still had to meet them. This rigidity turned temporary disasters into long-term economic spirals. Famine led to unpaid taxes. Unpaid taxes led to confiscated property or imprisonment. Confiscated property shrank the productive base. Shrunken output led to even fewer taxes. And so the cycle deepened. The imperial response was to enforce harder, more officials, more record-keeping, more assessments, but not more flexibility. In many regions, especially in Gaul and the Balkans, entire communities chose to abandon their land, rather than live under such pressure. Others accepted the protection of large estate owners, trading their independence for security. The Roman state still recorded their taxes on parchment. But the people were gone. The rise of the estate and the fall of the state. As smallholders collapsed under tax burdens, large estates known as latifundia grew. These estates were often owned by senators, generals, or bishops. They had private garrisons, grain storage, workshops, religious buildings. In effect, they became self-contained societies. The coloni who lived on them had little connection to the empire. Their loyalty was to their local patron. Their taxes were often paid in kind, if at all. Their disputes were resolved privately. The imperial government, overwhelmed and underfunded, allowed this. Why? Because large landowners could deliver results. They fed cities, they raised militias, they maintained roads. The bureaucracy couldn't. So the empire increasingly outsourced governance to private power, and once power leaves the state, it rarely returns. Bureaucracy meets the barbarian. One of the ironies of the late Roman state is that even barbarian invasions were treated as administrative problems. When the Visigoths crossed into Roman territory in 376 CE, officials debated how to feed and settle them, but not whether they should be there. When the Huns raided the Balkans, local governors requested aid, filled out paperwork, and waited. Even when Alaric laid siege to Rome, the imperial court in Ravenna tried to negotiate using formal diplomatic channels, rather than military force. This wasn't cowardice, it was habit. The bureaucracy had become the empire's first instinct. But by the 5th century, the threats Rome faced moved faster than its paperwork. And the foederati, foreign groups hired to protect the empire, began acting on their own. Rome had lost not just its flexibility, but its monopoly on violence. The emperor's court could issue orders. The Goths could take cities. Identity in a bureaucratized world. What did it mean to be Roman in the age of forms, quotas, and officials? It meant carrying a tax certificate. It meant knowing which office handled land disputes and which handled military exemptions. It meant understanding imperial law and Christian doctrine. It meant duties, not rights. The Roman citizen was no longer a political actor. He was a subject in a system. And yet, this very system preserved Romanness long after the empire weakened. When the Visigoths and Franks took over former Roman provinces, they adopted Roman law. They employed Roman administrators. They maintained tax systems and record-keeping. The ghost of Diocletian lived on not in marble statues or grand titles, but in filing cabinets and tax rolls. The Christian Church, bureaucracy's heir. By the 5th century, the only institution to rival the imperial bureaucracy in structure and reach was the Christian Church. And in many ways, it modeled itself on Diocletian's empire. Dioceses, same name, smaller territories. Bishops instead of governors. Councils instead of imperial edicts. Clerks, archives, and rituals. When imperial offices collapsed in the West, bishops filled the vacuum. They administered poor relief. They negotiated with barbarian kings. They preserved Roman culture. They even, in time, codified canon law, a legal system parallel to Roman civil law. The church didn't just survive Rome's fall, it inherited its tools. Diocletian's machine without Diocletian. By the late 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a fragile husk. Emperors ruled in name. Real power lay with generals, landowners, and barbarian kings. And yet the bureaucracy remained. Records were kept. Officials sent reports. Tax assessments continued, even in ghost towns. The empire fell in 476 CE when Romulus Augustulus was deposed. But the machinery didn't stop. In some areas, it kept running for decades. In others, it became the foundation of medieval administration, reformed, repurposed, but unmistakably Roman in origin. And so, a final question emerges not about failure, but about endurance. When an empire builds a system too large to dismantle, does it ever truly fall, or does it simply forget why it exists? The Western Roman Empire formally ended in 476 CE. A Germanic warlord, Odoacer, deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, sending the imperial insignia back to Constantinople. There was no cataclysm, no fire, no final battle. The machine simply shuddered and passed into other hands. But what did fall? Was it the empire's borders, its army, its identity? Or was it the weight of a system that had outlived its purpose? To understand the fall of the Western Empire is to understand the long echo of Diocletian, how his reforms, conceived in crisis, became structures too rigid to adapt, too essential to abandon, and too inert to inspire. We'll examine how the spirit of Diocletian's system lived on not just in the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire, but in the church, feudalism, and even modern government. Byzantium, Diocletian's true heir. While the Western Empire withered, the Eastern Roman Empire based in Constantinople continued for nearly another 1,000 years. It was wealthier, more urbanized, less exposed to frontier invasions, and it embraced Diocletian's legacy fully. Under emperors like Justinian, r. 527–565 CE, the Byzantine state expanded the bureaucratic model. Civil and military hierarchies were carefully separated. Officials were categorized by elaborate ranks and uniforms. Taxes were collected in coin and kind, with meticulous ledgers. Imperial edicts were codified in systems like the Corpus Juris Civilis. The bureaucracy became a career ladder, a structured, competitive and rigid hierarchy that served the emperor but outlasted him. Byzantine administration, with its layers of offices, rituals, and protocols, was perhaps the most direct continuation of Diocletian's dream, an empire of paper, ink, and rank. Even as emperors changed, the office remained. The Christian Church and the memory of control. While emperors came and went, the Christian Church, especially in the West, endured as a bureaucratic and moral authority. And Diocletian's influence echoed here too. Dioceses, bishops, presbyters all reflected Roman administrative structure. Latin remained the Church's language, preserving not only scripture but Roman legal traditions. Church councils mirrored Roman senatorial gatherings, debating doctrine as Roman officials debated law. By the early Middle Ages, the Pope in Rome wielded influence not unlike an emperor without armies, but with documentation, envoys, scribes, and edicts. Bureaucracy had become a spiritual tool, one that mediated divine authority, much like the imperial court had mediated earthly rule. Where Diocletian sought uniform belief in the gods of Rome, the Church succeeded, eventually making Christian orthodoxy a requirement of social and political legitimacy. What Diocletian failed to enforce with persecution, the Church secured through institutional continuity. From colony to serfs, the slow calcification of freedom. One of Diocletian's less visible legacies was the legal binding of peasants to land. His labor laws, designed to maintain productivity and tax collection, froze professions. Sons of blacksmiths became blacksmiths. Bakers remained bakers. Peasants became coloni, bound to estates. These measures were intended to provide economic stability and prevent flight from obligations. But over time, they hardened into hereditary status. By the 6th century, many coloni were indistinguishable from serfs unable to leave their land, subject to the demands of landlords, taxed by the state, and excluded from civic life. This transition, slow, bureaucratic, and unnoticed by the elite, marked the death of Roman civic freedom for the lower classes. In its place came feudalism, a system of mutual obligation rooted in land, labor, and protection. Diocletian had tried to stabilize an empire. He helped create a class system that would shape Europe for centuries. Administrative memory, a civilization that remembered how but not why. One of the quietest effects of bureaucracy is the preservation of form without content. Even as the Western Empire lost territory, soldiers, and political will, it retained record keeping, rank structures, tax policies, ceremonial offices. There were dukes without troops, treasuries without coin, and governors without provinces. Why? Because the system could not forget. Once offices were created and duties assigned, they lingered like ghosts in empty buildings. This phenomenon, administrative inertia, is one of Diocletian's most persistent gifts. It ensured that knowledge outlived those who applied it, that offices outlasted those who filled them, that procedures survived the crises that made them obsolete. Rome remembered how to run an empire, but not always why. The irony of control. At the heart of Diocletian's reforms was a belief that order could be imposed through structure, classification, and hierarchy. And for a time it worked. The tetrarchy ended the 3rd century military chaos. Tax reform stabilized state revenue. Bureaucracy extended imperial presence into every village. But over time, this control became constrained. Innovation slowed. Local initiative died. Administrators clung to precedent over problem solving. And when real crisis returned, invasion, famine, disease, Rome was often too organized to adapt. This is the paradox. Diocletian gave Rome survivability, not resilience. He turned a volatile, adaptable republic-turned empire into a machine that could last, but not evolve. And when the world changed too quickly, that machine couldn't keep up. Reflections from modern times. You, reading this today, live in a world that is still touched by Diocletian's legacy. Tax systems based on land and labor. Civil-military separation in governments. Professional hierarchies in administration. Bureaucracies that outlast their founders. You see it in your city halls, your social services, your school districts. You see it when forms matter more than outcomes. You see it when decisions take months because process trumps need. In this, Diocletian's ghost walks with us still not in grandeur or glory, but in filing cabinets, job titles, and procedural memos. It's not a haunting of fear. It's a haunting of intent without flexibility. Closing thought, legacy or lesson. Diocletian did not destroy Rome. He saved it on paper, with charts, formulas, and discipline. But in doing so, he left a system that, in its brilliance, forgot the people inside it. So we end with a question, not just for the past but for the present. When systems outlive their crises, do they serve stability, or merely the memory of survival? Story 5, Bread and Borders, the Grain Supply Crisis and the Urban Decline of Rome. The Roman Empire, for all its military might and architectural grandeur, was a civilization built on one of the simplest of human needs, food. And for centuries, grain was its currency of stability. It fed the legions. It calmed the crowds. It sustained an imperial capital that grew far beyond what its local resources could support. By the 2nd century CE, Rome had become utterly dependent on imported grain, primarily from North Africa and Egypt. This was not a supplementary convenience, it was a structural necessity. When that system faltered, even slightly, the effects rippled through everything: politics, military stability, urban life, and the empire's ability to project power. And when it collapsed, it marked the slow and hungry end of a way of life. In this story, we explore how the Roman grain supply, so mundane, so often overlooked, revealed the fragility of an empire, one shipment at a time. The grain shipments, a machine of logistics. At its height, the city of Rome was home to more than 1 million residents, a staggering number for the ancient world. The local countryside could not support this population. Rome was not self-sufficient in food, nor was it expected to be. Instead, it relied on a carefully orchestrated supply system centered around Egypt, particularly the Nile Delta; North Africa, especially modern-day Tunisia and Algeria; Sicily and Sardinia. Grain, primarily wheat, was harvested, collected under taxation, stored, and shipped via large cargo vessels across the Mediterranean to the port of Ostia, and then up the Tiber River to Rome. Each year, Rome required approximately 150,000 to 400,000 tons of grain. Failure to deliver this quantity not in a single year, but consistently meant hunger, unrest, and collapse of urban order. The annona, Rome's welfare state. The annona was the state's grain supply program, and by the 1st century CE, it had evolved into one of the most sophisticated food distribution systems in history. Eligible citizens, initially those on the plebs fermentaria list, received monthly rations of grain at subsidized or free prices. Later, this evolved into bread distributions, under emperors like Aurelian, who expanded the program to include oil, wine, and pork. The annona had several vital functions: prevent starvation, maintain public order, reward citizenship, create loyalty to the emperor. But it had a darker effect too. It made the urban population deeply dependent on a complex, fragile logistics network. Any disruption, storm, war, piracy was felt instantly. Grain and the empire's priorities. Because Rome itself could not be allowed to starve, the grain supply was protected at all costs. Ships carrying grain to Rome were given priority over all others in imperial ports. Soldiers were sometimes used as laborers during harvest seasons in Egypt. Emperors personally oversaw contracts with shipping guilds, collegia navicularum, offering incentives like citizenship, tax breaks, and even legal immunity. The state recognized that grain was power. In fact, many emperors from Augustus onward tied their legitimacy to the smooth operation of the grain supply. Coins from the period depict the Annona, grain goddesses, and ships symbolic proof that the emperor fed the people. And when food ran short, political consequences followed. Famines, real or feared, could spark riots, topple officials, or give rise to usurpers promising bread for the people. The barbarians and the grain routes. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the Mediterranean was no longer a Roman lake. Piracy resurged, naval patrols weakened, coastal cities in North Africa and Sicily were raided. Sea travel, once safe and reliable, became risky. The Vandals, who seized Carthage in 439 CE, were particularly devastating. With their ships, they disrupted Rome's grain flow at its source. One Roman chronicler noted that after the fall of Carthage, the people of Rome had to survive on emergency rations and whatever could be salvaged from inland regions. The empire had become strategically overextended, unable to protect its lifeline. And when the grain ships didn't come, everything else, government, order, civility, began to crumble. Bread and riots. Famine was not just a biological crisis in Rome, it was a political one. The urban masses, many of whom relied entirely on state-supplied grain, responded swiftly to food shortages. Mobs would attack granaries and bakeries. Prefects were dragged through the streets. Sometimes, entire neighborhoods turned violent. The poet Juvenal famously mocked the Roman plebs as caring only for panem et circenses, bread and circuses. But the truth was deeper. Food security was a matter of survival. When the circuses stopped, no one rioted. When the bread stopped, Rome burned. In 384 CE, a crisis in the grain supply forced the Emperor Theodosius to negotiate desperately with African provinces. The entire capital teetered on the edge of starvation, and only a last-minute shipment prevented catastrophe. By the mid-5th century, these emergencies became the norm, not the exception. The decline of Ostia and the river trade. Even Rome's great port, Ostia, began to decline. Silting of the Tiber made navigation difficult. Maintenance of the river infrastructure lagged. Warehouses sat empty. The imperial investment in grain transport shrank, replaced by improvised or local solutions. The Annona still existed on parchment and in imperial edicts, but the reality on the ground was different. By the late 400s, large-scale grain importation had effectively ended. Rome, the city that had once boasted of feeding millions with North African wheat, now survived on what could be hauled in overland, or what local bishops could arrange through charity. What was left of Rome? The decline of the grain supply was not just a logistical failure, it was a cultural and psychological rupture. Rome was no longer the hub of empire, it was a ghost of its former self. The Forum became pasture land. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. Markets shrank. Population plummeted from over 1 million to under 50,000 by the 6th century. And in a cruel twist, the city that had been synonymous with wealth, power, and abundance forgot how to feed itself. The imperial system had taught the people to depend. When that system failed, few were left who could replace it. Rome fell one missed shipment at a time. As we end this first section, consider this. What happens when an empire forgets how to feed its heart, and that heart begins to forget how to beat? The fall of a city does not always come with flames and blood. Sometimes it comes with silence, dust, and an empty bowl. Rome's decline was not an apocalyptic moment. It was a drawn-out unraveling of infrastructure, of logistics, of confidence in the very systems that once fed the greatest city in the ancient world. At the center of that unraveling was the fatting lifeline of grain. We explore what happened when the supplies slowed, when the ships no longer came, and when a once mighty capital began to forget what it meant to be imperial. A fragile supply chain in a brutal century. The 5th century CE was a period of disruption. Climate variability, plague, and invasions compounded existing problems. But for Rome, the gravest threat wasn't swords or flames, it was interruption. Interruptions to a supply chain that had once seemed eternal. Grain delivery was vulnerable at every point. Harvest failure in Africa or Egypt. Delay at port due to bureaucratic red tape. Shipwrecks during treacherous winter crossings. Blockade or raids by pirates or vandal fleets. Logistical backlog in Rome's overstretched docks. Previously, Rome's administrative muscle could respond, send additional ships, divert military escorts, requisition private supplies. But by the mid-400s, the system had lost its redundancy. When the grain didn't come, there were no alternatives, only waiting. The Vandal threat and the loss of Carthage. In 439 CE, the Vandals captured Carthage, Rome's key North African port city and agricultural powerhouse. It was more than a military loss, it was an economic heart attack. Carthage had been a grain metropolis, processing and shipping tons of wheat to feed Rome. With it in enemy hands, the empire faced a logistical black hole. Rome's response was muted. A few failed attempts at naval retaliation. Desperate treaties negotiated by Roman envoys. One brief military expedition under Emperor Majorian unsuccessful. The once proud empire could not retake its breadbasket. Instead, it had to negotiate with barbarians, sometimes offering gold in exchange for annual shipments of grain. These arrangements were tenuous, and Rome never regained secure access to North African wheat. The Annona collapsed shortly afterward. The Annona unravels. As central supply faltered, the Annona system began to degrade. Eligibility lists became outdated. Storage warehouses emptied, then closed. Grain officials resigned, fled, or took bribes to reallocate what little remained. Distributions became irregular, symbolic. The citizens who had once lined up monthly for measured grain found themselves increasingly on their own. Rome became a city of small-scale subsistence. Garden plots in former plazas. Chickens kept in abandoned courtyards. Black market bread sold at outrageous prices. The emperor, when still present, issued edicts promising reform, but the warehouses were quiet, the docks were empty. And the people of Rome learned a bitter truth. No system, no matter how intricate, survives without the will and resources to sustain it. A bishop in place of a bureaucrat. Into this vacuum stepped a new figure, the Christian bishop. By the late 5th century, the Bishop of Rome had become not only a religious leader, but a civic administrator. With imperial authority absent or impotent, it was bishops like Leo I, Leo the Great, and Gregory I, Gregory the Great who negotiated with invading generals, reorganized grain supplies from surrounding regions, coordinated care for the urban poor, converted ancient warehouses into charity kitchens. Gregory the Great, writing in the late 500s, described his efforts to create what amounted to a Christian version of the Annona. It was less efficient, smaller in scale, and dependent on church landholdings, but it was something. Where the empire had abandoned its people, the church remained. Rome's soul had migrated from the forum to the pulpit, from the prefect to the priest. Urban decline, from metropolis to memory. As the grain failed, so too did the urban framework of the eternal city. Public spaces fell into disuse. Baths were abandoned as aqueducts failed. Temples were either destroyed or repurposed into churches. Markets shrank then vanished. The population declined sharply. From over 1 million during the 2nd century CE, it likely dropped below 100,000 by the 6th century, and may have fallen as low as 40,000 during periods of famine and plague. Many neighborhoods were simply vacated. Grass overtook the paving stones. Livestock wandered freely. The great monuments remained, but they echoed with silence. Even the Colosseum, once fed by a complex network of underground mechanisms and vendor stalls, became a quarry for building materials. Rome had not been sacked by the Vandals or the Goths alone. It had been emptied from within. The psychological toll of hunger. We often speak of Rome's fall in terms of politics, warfare, and empire. But hunger changes people slowly, quietly. Trust in institutions eroded. Petty theft and violence became normalized. Families who once relied on public distributions turned inward, hoarding, hiding, retreating. The Roman ideal of civic engagement, once expressed through public works, theater, debate, and commerce, withered under the pressure of daily survival. And as the city shrank, so too did its ambitions. People no longer looked outward to an empire. They looked downward to their soil, their cellar, their local church. The Roman citizen became a medieval survivor. The rise of self-sufficiency. In the absence of a centralized grain supply, Romans began to rediscover subsistence living. Rooftop gardens and local grain plots dotted the urban landscape. Grain mills were operated by small households or religious orders. Rainwater cisterns were built atop collapsed infrastructure. It wasn't prosperity, it was adaptation. The great economic networks that had defined the Roman world were gone. In their place emerged localism, a dependence on nearby land, relationships, and barter. For centuries, Rome had boasted of its capacity to draw the world's bounty into its gates. Now, it relied on what could be grown within walking distance. A new center of gravity. By the late 5th century, the empire's center had shifted. Rome was no longer the political capital. Ravenna, Milan, and Constantinople held that role. Trade now flowed through Byzantine ports, Frankish towns, and Italian duchies. Rome, the once gluttonous heart of empire, had become peripheral and afterthought, a holy relic, a cautionary tale. And yet it remained inhabited. The city did not vanish, it survived. Not because the grain returned, but because the people adapted. As this section closes, consider this question. When the center can no longer feed itself, is it still the center, or just the memory of one? By the end of the 5th century, Rome was no longer a city of empire. Its population had dwindled. Its markets had shuttered. Its temples had crumbled or been claimed by creeping ivy and Christian altars. The grain ships that once glided into Ostia's harbor were now rare if they came at all. The empire had moved on, but Rome, in some quiet, enduring way, remained. We examine what was left. The psychological aftermath of losing the systems that once defined life, the transformation of Rome's identity, and how echoes of the great grain supply still shape cities and societies today. The infrastructure of memory. Even as Rome collapsed, it remembered. The infrastructure, the aqueducts, the roads, the silos, the granaries stood for decades, sometimes centuries, even in disrepair. These were not just functional constructions. They were symbols of a system that once worked. The Porticus Minutia Frumentaria, the central grain distribution warehouse, stood long after the Annona ceased. The Forum Boarium, once a bustling food market, slowly became a memory palace of past abundance. Empty Horia storehouses were reused for churches, homes, and animal pens. The Roman psyche, once conditioned to expect state-provided food and civic bounty, adjusted grudgingly. But the emptiness of the old structures lingered in the minds of the people. The silence of a warehouse once full is louder than the noise it used to contain. From civitas to community. In the empire's prime, the Roman civitas was more than a city, it was a civil body, a living machine of law, order, and provision. After the collapse of the grain supply, Rome's residents became something else, not citizens, not consumers, survivors. The Christian Church rose to meet some of the needs that the empire once addressed. Feeding the poor, healing the sick, distributing what little remained. Yet it did so through charity, not entitlement. The annona had been an institutional expectation. The church's grain was a gift of grace. This shift was more than theological, it was psychological. Romans went from being participants in an imperial economy to recipients of divine mercy. The bread still came, but now with a prayer instead of a ledger. The bishop as bureaucrat. By the 6th century, the Bishop of Rome had become the most important figure in the city, not the emperor, not the governor, not the general. Pope Gregory the Great functioned like a miniature emperor, overseeing grain imports from Sicily, distribution to orphans, widows, and monks, repairs to granaries, aqueducts, and walls. He corresponded with landowners, managed church estates, and even maintained granary records in Latin, a continuation of imperial form, applied to religious function. Gregory once wrote of feeding over 3,000 people daily in Rome, out of necessity, not excess. The church had taken over the annona's physical apparatus, its storehouses, its delivery schedules, even its clerical documentation. But it never reached the scale of the imperial system. Instead of systemic abundance, it was a patchwork of piety. The Vandal irony. The Vandals, who had disrupted the Roman grain trade so thoroughly, didn't destroy it entirely, they inherited it. After seizing Carthage, the Vandal kings continued to harvest and export grain from North Africa, sometimes selling or gifting it to Rome or Constantinople. But their control was limited and their motives inconsistent. The grain supply became a diplomatic weapon, a lever of pressure, not a stable lifeline. Rome could no longer guarantee its own food. Instead, it begged for it from barbarians, bishops, and distant provinces. This dependence reshaped the Roman identity from giver to supplicant. The transformation of urban life. The greatest cities of the Roman Empire, Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, were once fed by fleets and road caravans. Their growth depended on imperial logistics. When those systems failed, so did urban density. Public spaces became private plots. Colosseums were quarried for stone. Former markets were repurposed as fields or graveyards. Cities did not disappear, but they changed their function. They became defensive strongholds, religious centers, or rural trading posts, places of regional relevance, not imperial command. The Roman city model, dense, provisioned, cosmopolitan, was replaced by a medieval one, sparse, localized, and self-reliant. Food as identity. In Rome, bread had once defined belonging. To receive grain through the annona meant you were a citizen. You were part of the imperial project. You could expect structure and support from the state. When the grain was gone, identity changed. Now people were defined by their parish, not their district; their bishop, not their emperor; their local land, not the distant empire. Food was no longer a right. It was a struggle, a gift, a sign of divine favor or absence. Lessons in logistics. Rome teaches a hard lesson. No matter how advanced your systems, how rational your plans, or how wide your reach, your civilization is only as strong as its supply chain. Without food, cities depopulate. Riots begin. Trade stops. Institutions lose legitimacy. The Roman annona was not just about bread. It was about trust that the state would provide, that life could be planned, that the future was stable. When the grain failed, faith in Rome failed. The last distribution. No one knows exactly when the final grain shipment arrived in Rome under the annona system. There was no formal end, no last ledger entry with a ceremonial tone. Instead, it faded. A few more deliveries, a broken contract, a governor's failure to report, a bishop's quiet assumption of the task. And then silence. The fall of the Western Roman Empire did not come when Romulus Augustulus was deposed. It came years earlier, ship by ship, as the Mediterranean quieted and the fields of Africa no longer yielded to Roman command. The end came not with a bang, but with an empty warehouse. Modern echoes, cities that cannot feed themselves. Today, we live in global metropolises that, like ancient Rome, depend on distant places for sustenance. Our grain comes in trucks, planes, and container ships not from nearby fields. Rome's story is not just about history, it's about fragility. What happens if the supply stops? What if a climate event, war, or political shift breaks the chain? What do cities do when their logistics collapse? Rome's grain crisis is ancient, but it feels uncomfortably modern. Final reflection, when the empire becomes the city. As Rome shrank, the empire itself shrank with it until the two were almost the same thing. A struggling city, clinging to memory, drawing on spiritual capital, and slowly fatting into something new. In time, the empire would be remembered not for its laws, or its battles, or even its emperors, but for its ruins. Ruins that tell the quiet story of a city that forgot how to feed itself, and of a people who learned to live with less. So we end this story with a question that echoes across centuries. When the systems that feed us fall silent, what parts of our civilization will still know how to survive? Story 6. The Gothic Bargain, Rome's deal with the Visigoths and its deadly consequences. In the late 4th century CE, the Roman Empire made a decision born not from strength, but from sheer necessity. It allowed tens of thousands of Visigoths, a people it once called barbarians, to cross the Danube and settle within its borders. This was not a gesture of generosity, it was a desperate gamble. Faced with pressure from the Huns on the eastern frontier and declining military manpower, Rome needed bodies, laborers, farmers, soldiers. But in opening the gates to the Visigoths, Rome didn't just gain allies. It sowed the seeds of insurrection that would shake the empire to its core, culminating in one of its most humiliating defeats, the Battle of Adrianople. In this story, we explore how a short-term fix to a foreign crisis became an enduring disaster, revealing how desperation, mismanagement, and arrogance turned Rome's bargain with the Goths into a blow to its foundations. The Gothic migration, a people on the run. In 376 CE, the Visigoths appeared at the northern banks of the Danube River, begging for refuge. They were not invaders. They were fugitives fleeing from a force far more terrifying to them than the Romans, the Huns. These nomadic horsemen from the Central Asian steppes had crashed into Europe like a storm swift, brutal, and nearly unstoppable. The Visigoths, caught in the path of this tidal wave, had two options: fight and perish, or appeal to their old adversary, Rome. The Gothic chieftain Fritigern led his people to the Danube and sent envoys to the Roman Emperor Valens, then stationed in the east. The request: safe passage across the river into Roman territory. Valens' dilemma. Emperor Valens had a choice to make. He could deny the Goths, forcing them to fight or flee elsewhere, possibly turning them into enemies. Accept them under strict terms, disarming and resettling them as foederati allies of Rome. He chose the second. Rome, after all, had long used barbarian tribes as buffers, settlers, and even soldiers. With its own citizenry declining and legions stretched thin, the idea of adding 40,000 new settlers, many of them warriors, was appealing. But Rome wasn't prepared. The bureaucracy that once might have managed such a vast migration had grown corrupt, underfunded, and overwhelmed. What was supposed to be a controlled admission quickly became a chaotic flood. The river crossing, a disaster in the making. Roman officials allowed the Visigoths to cross, but failed to disarm them, a critical mistake. Worse, they failed to feed them. Local Roman commanders, including the corrupt Lupicinus, exploited the Gothic need for food by selling provisions at exorbitant prices. According to some sources, starving Goths were even forced to sell their children into slavery in exchange for dog meat. Anger simmered. The Visigoths, who had asked for protection, found themselves humiliated, abused, and manipulated. Rome had invited them in as refugees, but treated them as conquered enemies. From guests to rebels, the breaking point came when a delegation of Gothic leaders, invited to a banquet by Lupicinus, was ambushed and attacked. Whether this was a failed assassination or a show of power, it backfired spectacularly. Fritigern rallied the Gothic forces. No longer petitioners, they became raiders, burning Roman towns, looting grain stores, and defeating local garrisons. They were now inside the Roman Empire, mobile, armed, and furious. Rome had let the Goths in, and now could not control them. The Battle of Adrianople, catastrophe realized. In 378 CE, Emperor Valens led an army to crush the Visigoths, who had encamped near the city of Adrianople in modern-day Turkey. Valens believed the Goths were weakened, disorganized, and desperate. He refused to wait for reinforcements from the Western Emperor, Gratian. On August 9, 378 CE, the Roman army approached the Gothic encampment. What followed was one of the most crushing defeats in Roman history. The Roman forces were drawn into battle prematurely. Gothic cavalry, hidden from view, executed a devastating flank attack. The Roman line collapsed. Emperor Valens himself was killed, likely burned alive in a farmhouse where he had taken shelter. 2/3 of the Roman army was annihilated. Adrianople was not just a battlefield loss, it was a symbolic implosion of Rome's ability to dominate the barbarians it once manipulated with ease. Why Adrianople mattered. For centuries, Rome had maintained the illusion of control over external peoples through treaties, bribes, intimidation, and displays of power. Adrianople shattered that illusion. The Roman army proved vulnerable, even on home soil. Barbarian groups learned that Rome could be beaten. Future migrations became more aggressive, less diplomatic. In the years following Adrianople, Rome doubled down on its use of barbarian foederati, often with limited oversight or loyalty. The deal with the Visigoths had opened the floodgates. Rome's failure to adapt. In theory, Rome could have absorbed the Visigoths successfully. Other tribes had been settled before, integrated into Roman society, even elevated to military leadership. But the 4th century empire was not the Rome of old. Its civil service was riddled with corruption. Its military was increasingly reliant on mercenaries and divided loyalties. Its frontier governors had more power than the emperor could control. What Rome lacked wasn't strength, it lacked coherence. The Gothic debacle revealed an empire that could no longer coordinate, communicate, or contain. What the Visigoths learned. The Visigoths, on the other hand, learned a crucial lesson. They didn't need to invade Rome. They just had to wait for Rome to invite them in and then exploit its failures. After Adrianople, The Visigoths would roam the empire for decades, sometimes enemies, sometimes allies, culminating in their sack of Rome in 410 CE under Alaric, Fritigern's spiritual heir. That sack, the first in 800 years, was not an invasion from without. It was the bitter harvest of a deal gone wrong. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE shattered more than a Roman army. It shattered the illusion that Rome could control its borders. The Visigoths, once a refugee people begging for safe passage, had now bloodied the empire from within. But the story didn't end there. In the years that followed, Rome didn't expel the Visigoths. It couldn't, nor did it destroy them. It lacked the resources. Instead, it did something that once would have seemed unthinkable. It made the Visigoths part of its system, its armies, its politics, its very fabric. This section explores the years after Adrianople, the decades of fragile coexistence between Rome and the Visigoths. It was a relationship marked by mistrust, negotiation, opportunism, and slow-burning collapse. The empire's future was now entwined with those it once called barbarians. Picking up the pieces. After Adrianople, the Eastern Empire reeled. Valens was dead. The field army was devastated. Cities in Thrace were vulnerable. Panic spread through Constantinople. The emergency response came not in the form of military retaliation, but through a man named Theodosius I, appointed Eastern Roman Emperor in 379 CE. Theodosius's task was clear: stabilize the region, secure the frontier, and contain the Gothic threat. But Rome no longer had the strength to drive the Visigoths out by force. A barbarian settlement. In 382 CE, Theodosius did something bold and controversial. He negotiated a treaty with the Visigoths. Terms included: the Visigoths would be settled within imperial borders, primarily in Thrace. They would retain their own leaders, customs, and military structure. In return, they would serve as foederati auxiliary troops under Roman command, fighting Rome's wars when called upon. To many Romans, this was an outrage. The empire had ceded territory, autonomy, and honor to a people who had recently slaughtered a Roman army. But Theodosius saw little choice. The alternative was continued warfare with a mobile, well-armed, and angry Gothic population roaming freely inside the empire. This was the Gothic bargain: Rome's survival in exchange for its sovereignty. Foederati, a double-edged sword. On paper, the foederati system seemed beneficial. Rome gained soldiers without having to conscript or pay them in the traditional way. The Visigoths gained land and a semi-legitimate place within the empire. Warfare for the moment ceased. But the reality was more complex. The Visigoths were not integrated into Roman society. They retained their tribal identity, fought under their own generals, and often had little loyalty to the Roman state. Over the following decades, this uneasy arrangement produced localized rebellions when supplies ran out or promises were broken, political tension between Gothic generals and Roman officials, a slow erosion of Roman authority in the regions where foederati were settled. Rome had turned to the Goths as a solution, but discovered that the solution had its own agenda. Alaric, a Gothic leader within the empire. In the early 5th century, a Visigothic nobleman named Alaric rose to prominence. Alaric had served Rome as a military commander. He knew its politics, its weaknesses, and its military doctrine, but he never saw Rome as his home. When denied promotions and neglected by Roman officials, Alaric led his people in a series of rebellions and negotiations, demanding a permanent homeland for the Visigoths, recognition as equals, not auxiliaries, a generalship within the imperial army. Rome refused, and Alaric, like Fritigern before him, realized something dangerous. You could get more from Rome by threatening it than by serving it. The sack of Rome, 410 CE. In 401 CE, Alaric invaded Italy. Over the next several years, his armies marched up and down the peninsula, seizing cities and negotiating with emperors. In 410 CE, after months of fruitless diplomacy and broken promises, Alaric laid siege to Rome itself. The city, once thought impregnable, fell without a full-scale battle. On August 24, 410 CE, the Visigoths entered the city unopposed. They looted, yes, but they also spared churches, avoided indiscriminate slaughter, and left within 3 days. It was not a destruction, it was a symbolic act. The Visigoths had shown the world that Rome was vulnerable, that the emperor could not protect his capital, and that the bargain struck in 382 had come full circle. Why the sack shocked the world? Rome hadn't been sacked in over 800 years. To outsiders and Romans alike, the event was apocalyptic. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, lamented, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." But the real damage wasn't physical, it was psychological. Cities across the empire questioned the value of imperial allegiance. Roman citizens wondered if barbarian rule might be preferable. The idea of Rome as the eternal, invincible city died. And yet this too was part of the Gothic bargain. Rome had welcomed the Goths in, used them as soldiers, mistreated them as inferiors, and failed to understand their rising ambition. The Visigoths after the sack. Alaric died shortly after the sack of Rome, likely from illness, but his people did not vanish. The Visigoths moved into Gaul, and later into Hispania, Spain, where they established the Visigothic kingdom, a semi-independent realm that would last until the Muslim invasions of the 8th century. Ironically, they would go on to adopt Roman law, Latin language, and Christian religion. The Goths had entered Rome as outsiders. They left as the new Romans. The empire's loss of control. By settling the Visigoths, Rome had set a precedent. In the decades that followed, other barbarian groups demanded similar treatment. The Franks in northern Gaul, the Burgundians along the Rhone, the Vandals, who eventually seized North Africa. The empire's response to each group was the same: bargain, bribe, or break. But with every deal made, imperial authority shrank. What had once been an empire of Roman law and citizenship became a patchwork of tribal federations under nominal Roman oversight. The empire wasn't conquered in one blow. It was balkanized through diplomacy. Rome's short-term thinking. The decision to admit the Visigoths had seemed pragmatic. It solved an immediate crisis. But Rome, once master of long-term strategy, had become short-sighted. It could not field large armies. It could not tax effectively. It could not govern at the scale required. By outsourcing its defense to the very groups it feared, Rome accelerated its own decline. The Gothic bargain was not just a treaty. It was the outsourcing of sovereignty. A warning in hindsight. Rome didn't fall because of the Visigoths alone, but its failure to manage them, to integrate them, and to foresee the consequences of empowering them inside its borders. This was a turning point. It demonstrated a pattern that would define the empire's last century. Desperation leading to hasty compromise. Short-term solutions undermining long-term stability. Barbarians within, not just beyond the gates. The Visigoths were a mirror. In them, Rome saw both its past glories and its coming fate. Rome's long, uneasy relationship with the Visigoths began with a plea for refuge and ended in a transformation that neither side fully anticipated. By the mid-5th century, the Roman Empire was no longer the empire it had been, not in leadership, not in military power, and not in cultural composition. The Visigoths were not merely guests in Roman territory. They were no longer outsiders. They had become Rome, or at least what remained of it. We examine how the Gothic settlement led to the barbarization of Rome's institutions, the political legitimization of Gothic power, and how the so-called fall of the Roman Empire was as much a transition of identity as a collapse of authority. This is the story of how barbarians became emperors, and how Rome's future was written not in Latin, but in the hands of men like Alaric, Wallia, and Theodoric Visigoths who took up the mantle of empire, even as they helped dismantle it. The post-sack reality, a new kind of empire. After the sack of Rome in 410 CE, the empire did not collapse overnight. In fact, it staggered on for another 66 years in the West. But the nature of that empire had changed. Emperors were increasingly figureheads, manipulated by Gothic generals or regional warlords. The Senate, still intact in name, had little influence beyond Rome's immediate vicinity. Real power lay with the military, and the military was now dominated by barbarian commanders. The line between Roman and barbarian blurred. The Gothic kingship, Wallia and the migration west. After Alaric's death, the Visigoths elected a new leader, Wallia. Wallia did what Rome itself could not, defeated the Vandals in Spain on behalf of the empire, securing food and legitimacy for his people. In return, the Romans granted the Visigoths land in southern Gaul, particularly in the province of Aquitania Secunda. This arrangement wasn't framed as a conquest, it was a contract. The Visigoths were officially federates, allies allowed to settle in exchange for military service. But Wallia's people retained their identity. They had their own king. They upheld Gothic laws. They operated parallel to, not beneath, Roman authority. This was no longer integration, it was cohabitation. The rise of Theodoric I. Wallia was succeeded by Theodoric I, one of the most important Visigothic rulers. Under Theodoric, the Visigoths expanded further into Gaul. They established their capital at Toulouse. They acted increasingly as independent powers, negotiating with other barbarian groups, Roman provinces, and even emperors on near-equal terms. When Attila the Hun invaded Gaul in 451 CE, Theodoric fought alongside Roman forces at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. This wasn't just a moment of unity, it was a sign that the Visigoths were no longer mere foederati. They were stakeholders in the survival or division of the empire. The line between Gothic kingdom and Roman province had vanished. The Gothic court and Roman culture. One of the most fascinating legacies of the Gothic settlement is how quickly the Visigoths began to adopt Roman customs, dress, and religion. They embraced Latin, using it for administration and diplomacy. They retained Roman legal concepts, even issuing their own codes based on Roman precedent. They converted to Christianity, though initially Arian, later Nicene, and became religious patrons like the emperors had been. The Visigothic kingdom was no longer barbarian in the old sense. It was a hybrid state, part tribal confederation, part Roman provincial government. In time, these rulers no longer aspired to destroy Rome. They aspired to inherit it. The collapse of the Western Empire, 476 CE. In 476 CE, a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. There was no civil war, no sack, no burning of cities. Just a letter sent to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, stating that the West no longer needed a separate emperor. Odoacer would rule Italy as a viceroy under the nominal authority of Constantinople. It was the quietest revolution in history. The Western Roman Empire, the one that had struck the Gothic bargain a century earlier, was now formally gone. But Roman life continued under Gothic rulers in Roman cities, using Roman laws. Theodoric the Great, a Gothic emperor in all but name. In 493 CE, Another Visigoth, Theodoric the Great, seized control of Italy. He ruled from Ravenna as king of the Ostrogoths, but styled himself with imperial grandeur. He maintained Roman senatorial offices. He preserved the Western legal code. He invested in public buildings, aqueducts, and roads. He corresponded with Eastern emperors as a peer. Though never officially crowned by Constantinople, Theodoric ruled a Roman world in all but name. He even retained a Roman court, with Latin-speaking administrators, and sent ambassadors across what remained of the old empire. He wasn't the destroyer of Rome. He was its caretaker. What was lost and what was transformed. The Gothic presence in the empire marked the end of certain institutions. The professional Roman army, as it had been. The central taxation system. The idea of a unified imperial command across the West. But much was retained: language, culture, even bureaucracy. Rome did not vanish in a puff of smoke, it was reconfigured. What emerged was Europe, a patchwork of kingdoms, each with Roman roots, Gothic rulers, and Christian faith. From barbarians to founders. The Visigoths began as outsiders, desperate for shelter. They were welcomed, abused, resisted, and then incorporated. Over time, they became the foundation for several modern European states. In Spain, the Visigothic kingdom became the framework for later Christian reconquest during the Islamic period. In France, the Merovingians and later Carolingians drew from Gothic traditions and laws. In Italy, Theodoric's rule set precedents for medieval kingship. The Gothic bargain wasn't just about a moment of military desperation. It was about the long, slow transmission of imperial DNA into a new species of power. Reflections on empire and identity. In the 4th century, the idea of a barbarian sitting on a Roman throne was unthinkable. By the 6th century, it was inevitable. This change was not simply military, it was conceptual. Rome had once been a city, then an empire, then an idea. That idea, law, citizenship, governance, proved so powerful that even those who shattered Rome's defenses sought to embody its spirit. The Visigoths didn't just defeat Rome, they became Rome in a new form. What the Gothic bargain teaches us: that inclusion without integration is unstable. That power granted in desperation often outlives the crisis. That those treated as outsiders today may shape the heart of power tomorrow. Rome thought it was buying safety when it admitted the Visigoths. It was, in fact, buying transformation. And so we leave the Gothic bargain not as a story of loss, but as a story of inheritance, how the ashes of empire can nourish the seeds of something new.